Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto unsealed the Celestial Phoenix DNA? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, do not forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. Embers under Konoha. Night in Konoha was never truly quiet. Even when the streets went to lanterns and hushed laughter, the village breathed, wood settling, water murmuring under bridges, wine slipping through prayer flags that had outlived 3 Hokage. From the ridge line of the Hokage monument the roofs were a scatter of warm squares, lines of light cutting alleys into soft, navigable rivers. Naruto skimmed the lip of a tiled eave and dropped, knees bending. Sandals kissing stone with a sound too small to disturb a cat. South Quarter, Warehouse District, he whispered into the throat mic Tsunade made them wear whenever he was officially on patrol. 2 signatures avoiding choke points, moving like they memorized the guard map. Hinata. 4. Hinata said quietly. She stood half in shadow beneath a canted utility pole, head tilted so her hair fell like ink. 2 ahead, 1 above on the rain gutters, and 1 under. There's a drainage tunnel that bypasses the check net. They're going for it. He loved how she spoke. Precise as a blueprint. Calm even when his pulse inched high. Loved it in the way you love a good wind at your back, a hand finding yours without looking. Above is mine, Naruto said. Tunnel is you. If they dive, cut them off. He didn't wait for agreement. She would move. She always did when someone needed the quiet path held. He sprinted, hips low, hands loose, and led momentum right lines over the rooftops. 3 leaps and a whip swing over a street altar, and he was parallel with the gutters, where a lean shadow ran without sound and without the telltale lift chakra use gave a human stride. The shadow glanced, startled, saw only a boy in orange and dismissed him. That was always the mistake, thinking he was loud because he liked to laugh. Naruto surged and cut across the man's paw, with a short hop that brought heel to jaw. The man twisted away, absorbing the hit into a tumble that had been practiced 100 times in a place that taught bad men to survive. A bell on his wrist chimed once. The air changed. It wasn't visible. It wasn't even loud. It was the absence inside the chime, a hollow note that seemed to drink something out of him, like trying to yell underwater. Nah. Naruto felt his chakra lips stick against each other when he reached for a clone. His palms prickled, the hair on his arms lifted, and the world tightened around the point where the bell tone still trembled between roofs. The man smiled behind a blank half mask the color of old bone. No tricks, he said, voice muffled. Run if you want. False advertising, Naruto said. He feinted right, then drove left with a straight punch. They fought in the narrow channel between rain barrels and chimneys, bodies knocking dust and soot into gray ghosts. The masked man never committed to a kill, just kept him busy, kept him displaced. Fed him angles that made Naruto drag a step longer than he should. Naruto liked honest fights. This wasn't one. Somewhere below, a second bell chimed. Hinata. He smelled wet earth and iron. Naruto slipped a punch, low enough that his cheek brushed tile, and he did something simple instead of clever. He hooked the man's leg and yanked. The man recovered with a cat's twist, but it bought a heartbeat. That was enough. Naruto dropped a finger's worth of chakra into his heel and shoved off, not to strike, but to slide, hips low, weight forward, using the curve of the rooftop like a ramp. He let gravity have him. Another chime stabbed his ears and tried to turn his jump into a misstep. It almost worked. He hit the alley wall with the flexible snap of a boy who had hit 1,000 walls. He didn't think about that bell. He thought about Hinata's voice a minute ago, soft, 4. She'd seen the one under. The under was the problem. They were angling for the tunnel Bako. Say the tunnel would spit them into the dark cut that ran beneath the Hokage mountain and past the old storage vaults. Hinata, he said into the mic, breath even. Converging on the tunnel mouth. She answered at once. Yes, I'll take the bend. They'll try to slip under the maintenance bridge. 2 have bells. 1 carrier with a sealed case. A casket. Uzumaki sigils. Spiral with feather linework. Old. I think. Naruto, it's old. Quote. He didn't know why her saying old made something inside him lift, equal parts thrill and warning, but it did. He bounded across the alley, found the ladder he knew would be there. Slid the last 5 rungs, and cut left through a gate kept closed by habit rather than lock. His sandals hit damp concrete. The tunnel mouth breathed cold. Above, another chime. Below, a darker one. He didn't plan to be tactical, not tonight. But the bells made planning a necessity. They made his chakra feel like a clenched hand, and when he tried to force it, the hand clenched harder. He pulled breath in through his nose and matched it to a count. One Hinata had taught him on a bench after a long mission, when he'd come back vibrating with too much fight left over. In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. The concrete tunnel had an echo that loved even the softest footstep. He moved like someone carrying teacups stacked too high. The air tasted of rust and standing water. And the light was the flat kind from old service bulbs, turned to a yellow haze by mist and age. Hinata appeared out of the gray as if she had stepped out of the idea of quiet. Her eyes were bright with Byakugan and worry. 3 seconds, she whispered. There at the bridge. The 4th is above us. Naruto smiled, small and easy. I'll say hello. He peeled off into a lateral service run. Sprang up a handrail and caught a beam that had once held something useful. The 4th had chosen poorly. There was no way to bell the ceiling without ringing the whole tunnel. Naruto came in upside down, hair hanging, and put 2 fingers into the hollow behind the man's jaw where sound and blood lived. The man went limp and sagged into Naruto's arms heavier than he looked. Naruto hauled him onto the beam with a grunt. Movement ahead. The other 3 were already crossing the maintenance bridge, a span of steel grating with a lip, slick with condensation. The middle man cradled a casket the size of a bread loaf and the weight of a secret. Hinata ghosted to the near end of the bridge and put her back to the wall so she could watch arcs and trajectories. 3 on the crossing. The carrier is steady. Leader at point. The bell is, it's in his staff. The tone vibrates. There. And there. He's setting it to catch us at mid-step. Naruto nodded and tried to make space in his head for the way sound moved. He could feel the bell like the memory of something cold against his teeth. He could also feel something else, like heat coming off of his own skin, but he didn't want to think about that yet. Because naming a thing too early sometimes scared it off. On my count, you take right rail, he said. I'll go high. Hinata turned her head until the veins at her temples stood out in petal lines. 3 breaths, she said. The leader's foot will slip at the half plate where the weld is weak. Perfect. The leader was nothing to look at. The kind of anonymous, durable man whose face would disappear in a crowd even if he set it on fire. His staff was more interesting. A black iron rod banded with little unseen things that glinted like oil under the tunnel bulbs. The first bell tone he sounded this close was less chime and more absence. Naruto's skin prickled. Now, Hinata whispered. Naruto moved. He went high, which is to say he jumped, but it was not a jump like he was used to. He didn't push chakra into his calves. He didn't draw it down to his feet like usual. He drew breath and something else drew up with it, like heat gathering to a point past his sternum. He didn't consciously choose to let it go. It chose to exit. His body flickered a half step farther than he'd planned. Wing step. A word breathed somewhere behind his heart. He caught the steel lip and vaulted the leader with a baton glancing his side. Hi, Naruto said, because he was not built to be serious for more than 3 breaths at a time. He palmed the staff as it came up. The bell sang again, harder. He air around his hands felt thick as syrup. The carrier kept moving. That was the problem with professionals. They didn't get distracted by kids with messy hair. Hinata was on the right rail like a dancer on a line. Fingers a blur as she touched pieces of the grating that Naruto hadn't even registered, then stepped back in at angles that gave the carrier nowhere to go but toward a thin slice of a aisle that terminated in a maintenance ladder. The carrier changed grip on the casket, smooth, practiced, and then a crack jumped in the grating somewhere behind Naruto. The leader's foot slid on the W.E.A.K. weld and that should have been a win. It wasn't. He'd planned for the slip. He leaned into it, rolled the bell along the rails, and the note that came out of the staff was special in a way Naruto refused to describe. Because description would not help him move. It swallowed everything he reached for. It told his body to think of a mistake he had made last week and play it on loop. It tried to take the now away. Naruto didn't accept that. He didn't shove chakra at the problem, he had already felt how the bell made chakra shy. He did something else. He laughed once, sharp and mean, and filled his lungs like he had stood over ramen on a cold morning. The heat in his chest that had made his jump longer than a jump should be came back in a rush that smelled faintly of singed dust. It gathered like birds turning together. He didn't scream at the bell. He sang. No melody, just a sound that started where breath met stubborn and rode out. It wasn't pretty. It didn't need to be. It needed to exist. The bell's note found it and stumbled for the space of one heartbeat. The blankness that had been drinking him in found something it could not swallow. The staff quivered in the leader's hands. Hinata was already in motion. Now, she said, not a whisper this time but a word with a shape. She slammed her palm into the rail at the spot she had marked, and the shock traveled like a trick with cards. The carrier's foot hit the half plate and skated. He went down on one knee, arms tight around the casket, and Naruto was there without remembering his feet. Careful, he said, because even he was protective of the thing that meant enough to steal under bells. You'll break it. The leader struck at Hinata's head with the staff. Naruto moved without thinking. He caught the staff with both hands. It burned cold. The bell tone tried to crawl up his bones like winter. He didn't let it. He pulled the staff toward his chest and the heat cooled there surged. It climbed his arms like 1,000 tiny birds landing in a hurry. He smelled singed cloth. The staff's iron was too stubborn to glow, but something under it did. The bell sang a wrong note that made the tunnel lights flutter. Hi! Nada seized the carrier's wrist and turned it, so he had to choose between the casket and his balance. He chose the casket because of course he did. Naruto respected that even while he snapped the leader's staff into the tunnel wall and took a knee into the man's thigh. The man folded. The casket slid. Time pretended it would be linear and then wasn't. A slice of ceiling gave up its intention of staying a ceiling. It had been thinking about falling for 20 years, and tonight it remembered how. Everyone understood at the same time, in that specific way humans have when gravity makes a choice on their behalf. Hinata's head came up, eyes widening. Naruto didn't think. He stepped in front of her and put his back to the fall, arms wide. Don't, she breathed, and he did anyway. He felt rock more than saw it. He felt his own ribs like soft books on a shelf. He felt the bell tone carving away at his ability to be right where he was. He felt the casket hit the grating and bounce, but he had already tried enough, tonight, to be present. The heat that had been listening in his chest lifted its head. It moved, not in a line and not like fire. More like a wing unfurling in a crowded room. He felt it along his shoulders first. 1,000 points of prickling heat that were not quite pain. Something under the skin described feathers with temperature, not touch. The air in the tunnel, heavy and old, sloughed off him as if insulted. There was a sound like the world taking a breath and remembering how to exhale. The falling concrete sheet didn't stop. It just met something that was there now and hadn't been before. And its choice to fall turned into a choice to turn to dust. The impact that should have broken his back puffed outward in a circle of gray like chalk blown off a slate. Saint billowed and rode the hot air along the ceiling until it found a seam and poured away in a soft roar. Hinata stared at him in a way that made his ears warm. Naruto, she said softly, and then her training snapped her back into place and she was moving, catching the casket on the second bounce. The leader, to his credit, tried to capitalize. He drove his shoulder into Naruto's ribs. He might as well have tackled a clothesline strung through heat. Naruto pivoted, used the man's shoulder as purchase, and introduced his face to the grating in a Sandame-endorsed expression of civic responsibility. The bell went silent in the staff. That's better, Naruto said, breath coming back as the heat settled. It didn't leave, it tucked itself under his sternum like a coal with a mind and a schedule. He wasn't sure he liked that. He liked that Hinata was steadying her hands against the casket as if it had a pulse. You okay? She exhaled once and nodded. The look she gave him said more than the nod. I'm fine. The casket is, it's warm. Yeah, Naruto said softly. Me too. They weren't out of it. The carrier had let go to keep his arms, but he recovered with a fluidity that made Naruto thin. This man could pick pockets in the dark by listening. He had a knife in hand without a movement that could be taught. He went at Hinata like she was a wall he meant to carve a door in. Naruto moved to meet him. The problem was that the heat under his skin whispered now in a way his body couldn't quite track yet. He overshot his first step. Hinata didn't overshoot anything ever. She slipped to the side and flattened her hand into a strike that would stun without breaking, slid her heel between his feet, and the knife skittered away. She used the wall to lever him down and used the grating to encourage him to stay down. When the man tried to push against her, her palm slid to his shoulder and she whispered, "Don't," in the voice you carry for late-night kitchens and frightened children. He didn't. Naruto took the leader's staff apart the inelegant way. Heel, twist, leverage, and the kind of strength he'd gotten from spending a childhood lifting groceries and the world's expectations. Inside the iron was a bell the size of his thumbnail framed in a cage of wire that seemed to swallow light. He didn't touch it. He didn't trust that it knew what skin meant. He wrapped it in a strip of his sleeve and pocketed it. Anbu shadows, late because the bell tones had made their timing wish it was flexible, finally arrived in a set of shivers along the tunnel walls. The masks were different from the one Naruto had face-checked into tile, brighter, less willing to be anonymous. Cat crouched near the carrier Hinata had politely introduced to the floor. Dog took the leader off Naruto's hand. With a nod that acknowledged the state of the man's face as an honest accident. Package? Cat asked. Hinata offered the casket with both hands. Cat didn't reach. Tsunade-sama will want to see this opened in controlled conditions. You two are out. Med check, then debrief. Naruto touched his ribs and bright little sparks of heat skittered and settled like birds fluffing feathers. He looked at his hands, expecting burns. They were just hands. A line of soot cut across his forearm where the iron had kissed and failed to mark him. He drew breath to make a joke about being allergic to bells and stopped. Because the casket really did look like it was breathing. It wasn't. He knew that. But he could swear the pattern of Uzumaki spirals etched into the lacquer had a shallow pulse, and at each curve a feather line. The light caught and held as if it had nowhere better to be. Hinata saw where he was looking. Do you feel it? He considered lying. He wasn't good at it and Hinata was impossible to lie to. Yes, he said, small and honest, and the honesty made something inside him relax. Like it's listening. It is, Hinata said, so simply that he didn't have to make it a secret to bear alone. They moved out. The med bay had been forced into wakefulness too many times to resent it. Shizune had a checklist for everything. Glass fragments, concussions, chakra coil distortion, foreign tones in the inner ear. Naruto was one of her least favorite puzzles and favorite people. She ran her hands over him in a brisk, competent pattern. You shouldn't be standing, she said, and then prodded his ribs and made a face. You really shouldn't be standing. I have a healthy relationship with denial, Naruto said, and then hissed when she found the place where the leader's shoulder had said hello. It's not denial if the bruise is writing you a letter, Shizune said dryly. The scanner she held hummed over his chest. Its paper ribbon scribbled a pattern that was not a straight line. Hum good or interesting? Naruto asked. Both, Shizune said, and an expression flitted across her face that made him nervous. She didn't spook easy. She backed up, the ribbon whispering in a curl. Tsunade-sama will want to look. Hinata sat on the bed across from him, hands folded, breathing steady in the way she chose when she wanted to make the room a place. Her eyes were normal now, pupil and iris without the white. He needed them to be, just now. She didn't ask him what he'd felt under the ceiling because that was what made Hinata good company. She could stand beside your not knowing without reaching to name it for you. Tsunade came in like a low-pressure system. Quiet first, then thunder if the air didn't level. She had the casket in her arms and a line down the center of her mouth that promised 1,000 questions and exactly zero nonsense. You too, she said, and looked at them until their shoulders remembered what posture was. Good work. Tricky tech. I want a report on those bells before breakfast. Preferably with solutions that don't involve, try harder, and yell at them. Naruto opened his mouth, thought better, closed it. Hinata's mouth didn't even twitch. Tsunade put the casket on the counter with more care than she had ever given any expensive thing that didn't pour sake. Her hands hovered above it without touching, like she was letting the air remember where they'd just been. Shizune. Shizune slid the scanner over the casket's surface. The ribbon did a thing that paper should not do. Unknown harmonic. Not dangerous. Not active. But resonant. Naruto cleared his throat. It felt like it was listening. Tsunade looked at him for a long time with an expression that suggested she wasn't going to mock him and also wasn't going to indulge metaphors. Of course it did, she said. You're loud. He grinned. The grin made room for how tired he suddenly was. The door opened and a girl with red hair and glasses stepped through like a declaration. Karen Uzumaki made rooms sharper when she entered. She had been called by various titles since she'd chosen to move under Konoha's umbrella. Defector, consultant, menace, but Naruto had come to NK of her as a censor with no patience for fools and less for lies. You rang, she said, and then, oh, you. Her gaze hit Naruto and slid over him like a hand searching for a hidden pocket. Her nostrils flared. The casual contempt she wore as armor paused, then cracked. What did you do? Naruto lifted both hands. I did not break anything expensive. He paused. On purpose. You smell. Karen began, and then stopped. Because she had learned to be careful with words like you smell like in rooms with people who didn't have Uzumaki blood to soften the phrasing. She moved closer, one hand hovering over him without touching. As if his skin might be a surface that would lie. Her mouth tightened again, the small tug of a woman calibrating an instrument that had never been wrong. Shizune held out the ribbon from the chest scan like proof in paper form. 2 pulses, she said. Not arrhythmia, not clone noise. 2 beating signatures in 1 coil. Karen didn't look at the ribbon. She looked at Naruto's throat. It's not 2, she said softly, and the softness made his stomach drop in a way no bell had. It's 1 with an echo. No. She shook her head, impatient, not echo. Harmony. Soon. Ade's mouth did that down the center line again. English, please. Karen breathed out through her nose, a humorless little gust. He's got a second rhythm braided into the first. Not on top. Not parasitic. Threaded. It moves when he breathes in and settles when he breathes out. It's as if someone taught his chakra coil to hum a note it didn't know it could sing. She finally touched him then, a quick, efficient press of fingers to his wrist. Naruto felt her chakra test his like someone plucked a string in him and listened for the reply. Karen's eyes widened. Uzumaki imprint, she whispered. Old, and something else. Hot, hot, Shizune asked dryly. Hot, Karen repeated, dead serious. Like sunlight on stone. Like, she made a face at her own simile, like a bird you can't hold because it will burn your hands. And it'll be your fault if it does because you should have known better. Naruto looked at his hands. They looked like they always did. He flexed them and a thin, nearly inaudible crackle moved under his skin. Hinata's attention sharpened and warmed at the same time, and he felt both sharpening and warming in a place that didn't have a name not ridiculous. Tsunade put palms flat on the counter and leaned in over the casket. We can argue about poetic naming later, she said. For now, we handle threats and then we handle the thing inside you that Shizune will lab. Concerning. And Naruto will label, awesome, and I will label, a headache for me personally. Naruto started to grin and decided maybe restraint was a form of leadership too. He straightened a little on the bed. Threats first, then, bells, Hinata said, quiet and certain. They mute chakra priming. They drink technique before it can form. Tsunade grunted. Null hymns. I've heard rumors. IMYO funded zealots playing with vacuum notes. Kat's mask turned toward her. We picked one off the leader's staff, Kat said. Contained for analysis. The rest were on wristbands. The men were trained. Not missing nin. Not bandits. Quote. So professionals with bad toys and a shopping list, Tsunade said. The casket was theirs, now it's ours. Naruto saved your idiot lives by standing under a CE. Illing he had no business standing under. I was being romantic, Naruto said. And we now have 2 problems. An organization targeting divine blood artifacts we didn't know existed, and my least man. Ageable shinobi carrying something that sings. Tsunade lifted the casket's lid a fraction. Heat sighed out like a remembered summer. She closed it again as if that was all the introduction anyone needed. Sleep in the med ward tonight. Shizune, flags up. Karen, map him. Hinata, You're on watch because he listens when you breathe. I do not, Naruto said reflexively. Hinata's mouth twitched at the corner. He does, she said, equally reflexive, and then looked like she wished she hadn't said it aloud and also didn't regret it. Tsunade caught the loop and decided not to tread on it with jokes. You'll debrief at dawn, she said, and looked at Naruto one last time, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in the way a craftsman looks at a tool they might need to sharpen differently. Don't set my hospital on fire. Would never, Naruto said solemnly, and meant it. They let him rest then, which mostly meant his body gave up pretending it wasn't tired. Sleep was a rough sea. He drifted on it, warm. Ribs aching in a way that made breath noticeable. In one of the shallow places, he dreamed of heat taking a shape behind his ribs. Not fire. Fire was careless. This was older, and it was carefree. Like the sun is careful in winter. Measured and patient and assured of the morning. He didn't try to speak to it. He didn't know its name and hadn't earned it yet. He lay under it and felt soot lift off his skin the way dust had lifted from the tunnel ceiling. He woke to the low clink of a glass and Hinata standing by the window with her back to him, looking out at a village that had been new foe. Longer than many countries got to live. Dawn hadn't broken yet. The sky wore the gray of deciding. How long? He asked, voice rough, not wanting to startle her because he liked the way she looked when she didn't think anyone was looking. It was a specific kind of unguarded that most shinobi didn't allow themselves. An hour, she said without turning. You were dreaming. I didn't scream, he said. No, she said, turning then. You laughed. Better, he said, and meant it. Karen drifted in a half-minute later, rubbing eyes behind glasses and pretending she didn't have feelings in a room where people could see. She handed him a cup with something that smelled like burned honey. Drink and don't ask. He drank. It tasted like someone had boiled a forest and mixed it with regret. He made a face. This is revenge. This is medicine, Karen said. If I wanted revenge, I'd tell Tsunade what you said about her handwriting. I didn't say anything about. You thought very loudly, Karen said. She looked at Hinata. I need him to breathe with you again. Hinata raised an eyebrow, then eased closer until she was standing where his left hand would fall if he relaxed. She didn't take his hand because that would be a moment. And they were at work. She set her breath where he could hear it. In, 2, 3, 4. The heat under his sternum rose to meet her rhythm like a bird that wanted to land but didn't trust the branch. He softened his throat and let the exhale stand on its own legs, not pushing it. Karen's hand hovered over him, scanning not with a tool but with a talent that had made her an asset to people who didn't deserve assets and now made her dangerous in the right direction. Again, she said, twice. Then hold on the out. They did. The room got warmer in small, noticeable increments that the hospital thermostat would have called impossible. The metal bed rail lightened to the eye, then didn't. The heat didn't blast. It nested. Karen nodded, not satisfied exactly, but less annoyed at the world. It harmonizes with you when you listen, she said. When you shove, it resists. When you match rhythm, it gives you more than you asked for. That's a terrible relationship, Naruto said, and Hinata's mouth breathed a laugh that barely counted as sound but counted as reward. It's an Uzumaki relationship, Karen said flatly. Old line, old agreements, and some thing avian layered over it in a way that makes my teeth itch. She finally looked at the casket again as if it had been rude enough to exist in her peripheral vision without asking permission. It's in there, not the same as you. Kindred like two villages that learn to share a river. Do we open it? Naruto asked, just to make Tsunade appear, because that was how you made summons in Konoha. Yo. You said the wrong thing and the right person arrived to stop you. She did not appear. Shizune did, with a look that suggested Tsunade had said something interesting in the next room and Shizune had decided Naruto didn't need to hear it. You, she told him, are cleared for short movement with supervision. I love supervision, Naruto said. Supervision is my favorite. Good, Shizune said, and her glance at Hinata said please. But with the brittle around the edges that people who loved the village wore when they had seen too many mornings. Because Cat says the people we borrowed the bell from did not go home. They regrouped. They're at the north drainage, 100 meters from where you broke my ceiling yesterday. I didn't break. Someone broke it, Shizune said, merciless. Go be useful before they break something else. Naruto slid off the bed like he could convince his body it was a cloud. He swayed once. Hinata's hand came up, not touching his elbow, just occupying the space a fall would need. He steadied. The heat under his breastbone settled like approval and warning in one breath. Karen caught his sleeve as he moved past. She didn't hold him. She just made him feel the fabric pull so he would look at her. Don't overdraw, she said. You don't know what it wants yet. He grinned at her to hide a flicker of fear. I mean, it saved my back from a ceiling. We're friends. Karen didn't smile. You don't survive a ceiling by being friends with gravity. He nodded. He didn't promise. He learned better than that after too many promises made quick as excuses. He looked at Hinata and drew breath to match hers. The heat hummed a half note like it was pleased with both of them for noticing the other existed. They went without ceremony. Naruto liked that about missions. That mattered. The space between decision and motion got thinner. The north drainage smelled like rivers pretending to be obedient. The light was different here, less owned by Konoha and more owned by the earth. Cat had a team along the rim. Masks just at the wrong angle to catch the rising day. 3, Cat said. Same bells. Same gate. No civilians in their pockets this time. Naruto timed his BR. ETH without meaning to and felt that new undernote align like a coin sliding into place. He didn't tell it to. He didn't ask it to. He thought of the tunnel ceiling, the dust blowing outward like the belly of a candle when a door opened. He didn't want to depend on that. He didn't want to be the kind of shinobi who chased new edges without counting their cost. He wanted to stand where Hinata stood and feel his body make good choices. They took the culvert mouth in a V, Hinata right, Naruto left, Cat's pair above like patient hawks who didn't mind letting their prey choose its last path. The men waited this time. That told Naruto something he liked. They were not idiots. The leader from last night didn't show. A similar man did, wearing a new mask and holding a different staff. The bell. Tone he rang this time didn't eat chakra, it stunned feet. Naruto felt his ankles forget what joints were. He breathed and the heat flowed there with a short, annoyed wave, as if he had called it to swat a fly. He stepped and remembered how to step. Hinata's breath counted in the corner of his ear, and he moved on the now her voice held open for him. He didn't try for clever. Clever weighted down th. Erode when you had the measure of an enemy. He threw himself at the staff and put his shoulder into all the places Jiraiya used to yell about when he was being generous with lessons. The staff skidded wearily out of the man's hands. The bell in its throat tried to hum, and Naruto wasn't a singer, but he had always been loud. He made a sound that lived inside the hallway of his mouth and shoved it down the bell's throat. The tone died like a candle in a jar. Hinata took the carrier's elbow and turned him in a ring that ended with him face down, wrists cinched, dignity intact enough for him to walk into prison rather than be dragged. Cat's team dropped the third with an efficient combination of knees and rope. It felt like the village tightening a strap. Naruto stood still a moment after, listening to his breathing and not to anything else. The heat under his sternum made small adjustments, as if it were building something out of his breath he hadn't ordered. He didn't mind. He minded someone had come into their drains with bells that stole choices and thought it was acceptable because their cause said so. What do you want? Naruto asked the leader, who was not the leader, without menace. Why this case? The man turned his face. This close, Naruto could see the scar that ran under the mask like a pale riverbed. The man's eyes were tired in an honorable way. Not for us, he said. For the world that survives you. Quote. Hinata's hand shook once against the rope she was tying and stilled. Naruto breathed twice. Try believing in the world we already have, he said softly. Cat touched his shoulder. A weight without pressure. We'll take this one, she said. You take your heat and your poor decisions and go back to Tsunade before she puts a leash on you. He went. He wasn't sure if the heat under his sternum warmed at Cat's words because it liked them or because it was laughing at him. He chose to assume warmth. He chose to make it into a friend someday, even if today it had saved him out of its own interest. When they reached the hospital again, the casket had moved rooms. Naruto felt it before he saw the door guard. The heat in him leaned toward it like iron toward a magnet. Tsunade stood inside with her back to the casket and her hands in her pockets. I don't like coincidences, she said. And I don't like patterns I didn't vote for. But I like enemies less, and we have one. The Bell people? Naruto asked. Tsunade shook her head. Those are the men you can arrest. The enemy is a man who sent them with a map to our drains and a bell that eats jutsu. He's not doing it because he enjoys hurting shinobi. He's doing it because he thinks we make the world dangerous by existing. She tilted her head at the casket. He wants this because it's old and because it knows how to sing. Naruto swallowed. Do we open it? Tsunade looked at him a long time and saw, for once, the thing that had made Jiraiya shake his head with pride and irritation in equal measure. Not yet, she said. Not until we know what room to open it in so it doesn't make a mess of our house. You're going to rest. Then you're going to spar with someone annoying who can fly. Naruto blinked. Fu, Tsunade said. She arrived at dawn with a bell bruise on her you don't want to stare at because she will elbow you in the teeth. She says she's done running. I told her we had a boy who can set ceilings on fire with his back. She looked interested. Tsunade's mouth tugged. Also, Sand is sending Temari as a diplomatic observer because the words Uzumaki and Celestial were used in the same report. And Gaara asked very nicely. She turned, finally, and looked at the casket with the kind of move you make toward an altar and a weapon at once. You and your heat will not be alone in this. Naruto stood a little taller. Not because of what he was increasingly sure was living under his sternum, but because the village always felt like a hand behind his shoulders when he led it. Hinata's breath matched his without trying. Karen rolled her eyes and didn't move farther away. Somewhere a bell tower that wasn't theirs lifted a slow, careful note into the morning. Miles away, in a narrow spire that rose out of a cliff the color of abandoned iron, a man named Seimei received the report without flinching. He sat on a stool with his legs folded in the old way and the great bell staff across his knees. His hair had gone to gray not because of years, but because he had watched too many nights end in screaming and had decided he would rather be wrong cruelly than right too late. The phoenix stirred, his scout said. Seimei's fingers tightened around wood polished by discipline. He thought of cities on fire and children running until their legs forgot. He thought of how P.O.R. called power like storm fronts smelling each other across valleys. He thought of mercy and how small it looked when measured against ruin. Do not kill him, Seimei said. His voice was not a bell, it was a forge. It made things he could use later. Bring him in, if you can. Failing that, bring me the bell he broke. The scout bowed. Yes, Seimei-sama. When he was alone, Seimei set the bell staff upright and let it hum once. The note climbed the spire and touched clouds. A different note answered, far off. Not a bell. A long, low sound like thunder remembering its own name. Soon, Seimei murmured to the room. And what he meant was before the world remembers how to burn itself with old songs. He didn't imagine the bird. He wasn't a man given to pretty things. If he had imagined anything at all, it would have been a boy standing under a ceiling, hands empty, choosing to hold anyway. He rang the bell again, softer. The note changed the air. Somewhere south, a casket warmed and a boy matched his breath to a girl's and didn't notice that matching was a kind of prayer. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. Glass Tides of Uzushio. The sea forgot to be blue long before they saw the ruins. Dawn laid pewter on the water, and the long shoals that used to be streets flashed and vanished under silvered chop. Naruto rode the bow rope with his feet braced and his jacket zipped high, salt in his mouth and a good kind of dread in his bones. Konoha shrank behind them. Wind wrote temporary lines on the surface between here and there. Temari stood near the stern with one hand on the mast and the other on her hip. The fan slung over her shoulder like a promise. I don't love boats, she announced to nobody in particular. Karen shaded her eyes behind her glasses and squinted toward the horizon. Yo, you don't love anything that doesn't do exactly what you tell it. Temari smiled without teeth. Correct. Hinata was between them at the rail, hair tied up and eyes half closed, letting the bright edge of morning soften before she committed the Byakugan to it. When she looked at Naruto, it wasn't a warning so much as an anchor. Here, with me, breathe. He did, because he had learned that as long as he matched the room with Hinata in it, the rest of the world could wait its turn. They made landfall on something that used to be a district and was now a beach made of glass. Storm and sand and fire had married here and left hard children behind. The fused sheets stretched like frozen waves, bubbled and folded, catching light along seams. Houses had slumped into glossy dunes, archways cast reflect. Tions that had never seen themselves until now. Naruto stepped down and his sandals whispered. "Careful," Karen said. "Edges." He looked. The ripples had knife lips in places. He bent his knees and a small step the way he'd tried in the tunnel. Weight forward, breath up, a little lift where logic said there shouldn't be space to lift. Heat moved under his ribs, pleased to be near something that knew too much about fire. His body slid half a sandal's breadth farther than a step should. Wing step, again. He didn't force it. He made a note in his bones about which muscles had to be soft to let it happen without stutter. Tamari crouched and knocked her knuckles on the glass. It sang, low and stretched. "You hear that?" Hinata tilted her head. "Harmonics. Useful," Tamari said. She rapped. 3 different spots in a little triangle, each rang a slightly different pitch. "If those bell boys are around, we can make a choir the bells don't like." Naruto grinned. "I love it when you call them bell boys. Because it's belittling," Tamari said. "Because it's accurate," Karen muttered. She pointed with her chin toward the interior. There. Pockets of heat under the glass. Not geothermal. Remnant. Something burned long and careful under there. Hinata opened her eyes fully. The veins flowered at her temples and the sea stopped being stubborn for her. "There's a domed space," she said quietly. "Collapsed corridors around it. Sigils along the ribs. Water flows in and out at the south seam." "Low tide window?" Tamari asked. Hinata nodded. "Short. Then we walk like nin and not like tourists," Tamari said. And swung the fan down with a little snap that made Naruto's hair lift. "Stay off the edges. Use the folds." They moved. The morning brightened to the mean brightness of cloud-fractured light. The surface glared back at it in sheets. Naruto could feel the heat in him wake up fast in this place, like a kid who smelled festival dumplings from 3 blocks away. He didn't let it run. He let it pace. They were 2 ridges away from the seam when the first bell note touched the glass. It didn't ring. It arrived. The sound didn't feel like sound. It felt like being told to doubt your feet. Naruto's ankle rolled where it shouldn't. Hinata corrected him with a quiet throat sound he didn't know he'd been waiting to hear. Tamari lifted the fan and did something that wasn't a gust so much as a coax. The air slid over the glass like poured water. The sheet under them hummed a long low C. The bell note wobbled. "Called it," Tamari said, and then they were moving for real, because the bell boys were using kites. They came low, riding the wind shapes the sea made, cloaks cut tight, faces blank behind smooth masks. Each kite trailed 2 wires. From the wires hung spheres the size of cooking pots. The spheres weren't heavy. They weren't meant to be. They hung precisely above the glass and drifted in patterns that would mean something ugly if they settled. Naruto saw one. Stutter and flash as a bell tone tuned it. Shock cage. If that net dropped and linked, they were boxes. Tamari snapped the fan open to a third of its spread and dragged it along the glass in a narrow arc. Sound climbed the scale. Naruto felt it in his teeth. Karen hissed through hers. Not pain. Calibration. And pointed at the left bank of kites. "Those first," she said. "Their signals bonding the others." "On it," Tamari said. She drove a sharp, controlled gust into the glass sheet at a shallow angle so the singing rose a half step and bled into a grit-teeth squeal that made Naruto want to pun. Something just to make the irritation have a body. The left bank of kites bucked. One shock sphere sparked and fell with a clunk that wasn't heavy but felt final. The bell tone faltered. 3 masked, Ed figures slid down toe lines as if gravity had agreed to be a gentleman. The first hit the glass and rang a wrist bell that made the wind lose its nerve. "New pitch," Hinata said at once, fingers flicking, marking angles in the air. "Hi. Around, there." She pointed at a seam where 2 fused dunes met and sounded like a musician who had learned to count in these frequencies long before anyone gave her a lecture. Naruto slid to the seam and stomped it with the heel of his hand. The glass sang back at the bell the way a stubborn dog pretends not to hear you. The bell note skewed. The masked maw ends balance stuttered the half-inch it took to make a miss matter. Naruto went in elbows first. The man met him with neat hands and the kind of footwork that meant his teacher had hit him with sticks about it for years. Not missing Nin, Naruto grunted. Paid and practiced. The man didn't brag. He blessed Naruto with silence and tried to sweep his legs. Naruto jumped, heat lifting him just that bit he required, and brought his heel down on the bell band. It snapped. The sound died like a candle under a glass, suddenly and with a little hiss. Up in the wind, a kite banked too fast and dipped. The trailing shock sphere kissed the glass, flared, and wreathed itself in a net that looked like light until you imagined thinking inside it. Naruto didn't imagine, he moved. The net hit him and tried to teach his body about stillness. His heat didn't flare big, it tilted. A tight plume along his ribs shivered through the net like a steel cable under tension. The lines charred through with a smell like rain on slate. The sphere went black. He rolled out from under it with a laugh that was mostly nerves. "Don't touch the wires," Karen said, chewing on the end of the words like they were a pencil. "They carry a taste you'll hate for days." "Noted," Naruto said, deliberately wagging his fingers at a second sphere far enough away to count as teasing. "No snacks between meals. Lower your center," Hinata murmured, voice close. "Two more." They stir-stepped through arcs of noisy glass until they were under the kites. The masked team adapted. New bell note, sharp and insistent, dropped in L. Ike apparent clapping twice in a hallway. Naruto's calves seized. Temari swore. "Dislike," she said, and hammered 2 quick gusts into the glass, creating a weird beat of silence between notes that Naruto used like a held door. He slid through and shouldered a second man into a bubble of trapped air under a ripple. The man's mask hit the bubble and bounced. Naruto didn't allow him a second bounce. He finished the conversation with jerky efficiency. Then a shape came out of sky that wasn't a kite and wasn't a bird and was not, to Naruto's sudden delight, a bell. "Hey," a voice yelled from 40 feet up, bright as lemonade. "If I crash into you it's because I'm fearless and not because your wind lady is rude." Fu hit the wind like a kid who had been praying for someone to dare her properly. She wore green and orange like the countryside wanted to be a jacket. Chome's chakra leaked around the edges of her, wing petals unfolding and snapping with insect grace. A bell sphere tried to curtsy at her and make her stay. She shouldered it like a bully picking a fight with the wrong girl and laughed when it spun. "Hi," Naruto yelled back, because greeting was, in his considered opinion, a weapon. Fu flashed him a grin that could have been a thrown knife if she hadn't liked him on sight. "You're the ceiling boy." He decided he could live with the nickname. "You're the one who elbows teeth. Only when they deserve it," she said, and hoisted a shock sphere with astonishing, cheerful disrespect. She tossed it to Temari. "Can you pitch?" Temari gave Fu the look of a woman who had never been asked a better question. She flattened her fan and slapped the air. The sphere sailed, trailing sad, dead wire, and bounced off a kite's belly hard enough to make the pilot reconsider his life choices. The kite veered. "Good arm," Fu said, and then, "Bad bells. Hate them. Join the club," Karen said, and pointed again. "They're setting a third node. Disrupt that and the others die confused." "Got it," Fu said. She folded her wings and dove. The dive wasn't bird smooth, it was a controlled tumble with abrupt angles and an ugly beauty. She liked gravity. Gravity liked her back. She hit the node with her shoulder and laughed again as her wings flared with a whistle like a knife on glass. The bell tone went out with a hurt little hiccup. Naruto loved the part of fights where the plan PPED being hypothetical and turned into something you could taste. The kites broke off in 3 directions, losing nerve. 2 shock spheres netted the same patch of glass and made each other sad. Hinata tapped Naruto's wrist and pointed. "Small. The carrier." He had almost missed it because the world had given him too many shiny problems. The carrier moved like the one in the tunnel had, steady, professional. Casket tucked in a cradle under his arm that made him sleek and narrow. He used the fight as a parade to slide past. Naruto saw him only because Hinata's gaze collected what other people dropped. "Mine," Naruto said. "Yours." Hinata agreed. He ran. Not fast forward. Fast sideways, his body a series of low flickers. Wing step wasn't a power so much as a commitment to being exactly where his foot had promised him it would be. The glass didn't love him but it tolerated him. He slid into the carrier's lane and grinned so the man would make a mistake. The man did not make a mistake. He apped the casket into a belt clasp with one hand and drew a short blade with the other, grip reverse, low. Naruto feinted left. The man stabbed at nothing. No chakra tell to read telegraph, just a prek. Eyes human trying to puncture another precise human. Naruto let heat curl along his skin without granting it authority. The blade grazed the shimmer and popped like it had offended a stovetop. The man blinked, impressed despite himself. Sorry, Naruto said. Hot. Blasphemy, the man said, and meant the word like it was simple and not a sermon. Naruto liked knowing what people believed because it told him what they'd risk for it. He kept the man busy, seeing his stance was built for tight corridors and this glass plane was the wrong conversation partner. Tamari opened the fan behind the carry. And made the ground hum, the carrier's bones loose. He stumbled. Naruto snatched the belt clasp and twisted it. The casket popped free into his hands with a warmth that felt almost embarrassed. Sorry we keep meeting like this. A bell tone climbed, a new voice entering the fight. Naruto's heat flared in irritation rather than pain. He kicked the carrier's knee hard enough to be a lesson without making it break into a life sentence. The man fell into a neat bound courtesy of Hinata that would hold long enough to have a talk and short enough to call it fair. Cat's advance team shook the last kites out of the air. Shock spheres lay like deflated lanterns, sulking. Fu landed and bounced twice, then jogged over, wings twitching like they had opinions. Hi, she said, still bright. I got tired of getting chased. Thought I'd help the people who seemed to be punching the bells. We're very against them, Naruto said gravely. I'm Naruto. Fu, she said, and wiggled her fingers at Hinata and Tamari and Karen in one inclusive gesture that said I would like all of us to be friends unless you make it weird. You're the Byakugan. She said it to Hinata as a person, not a pair of eyes. Hinata smiled, small and warm. Hinata. Tamari said, and tilted the fan as if it were a tipping hat. Karen said, assessing Fu the way a doctor looks at a kid presenting with a grin and 20 scrapes. You're humming. Fu blinked. Am I? Neat. Karen's mouth twitched. We can use you. Fu grinned. I like being used for good things. Naruto did the thing Jiraiya had taught him to do. The fight's center shifted. He took stock. The glass had scuff marks now, little gray kisses where the shock spheres had tried to make the world tidy. The sea had not retreated as much as they'd hoped. The south seam would be accessible but not generous. Hinata touched Naruto's elbow to claim attention with minimal fuss. The dome is under that rise. She pointed to a blister of glass half drowned in an eddy. If we go now, we'll have 15 minutes before the water comes back to argue. Argue fast or drown slow, Tamari said. I pick fast. They crossed to the blister. Up close, the GLASS showed thread-thin lines where the fusion had done weird math with sand and storm. The seam was a narrow dogleg at shin height, not enough for a human comfortable with their skeleton. Naruto went low and breathed on it. Heat lifted off him the way steam leaves a rice pot if you crack the lid. The seam fogged and then cleared. A little breath count with Hinata and a little push with the flat of his hand and the seam loosened like a tight jar under warm water. They slid in. The dome didn't care about their eyes at first. It had been keeping candles alive inside it for decades without caring what visitors thought of the decor. Then the candles noticed company and stood up straighter. Light trapped under thick glass gutters, faces of guardians rendered in fire-eaten lacquer. The ribs of the dome were blackened wood that had not succumbed because somebody loved it very well and very long. They didn't talk about what is this place in the way people do when they're tired of pretending they don't want to talk at all. They moved through the dome like shinobi. Tamari kept the air moving enough to make the candles breathe. Hinata walked with her eyes open to every seam. Karen stacked Naruto's breath against a series of carved panels that smelled like singed citrus. Fu ranged along the ceiling with the casual heresy of someone who thought ceilings were just floors that had imagination. The center was not an altar and not a museum case. It was a work table. The lacquer had clouded where years of hands had warmed it. Tools lay in precise nests. Chisels with feathers etched along the handles, little bells with no tongues. A coil of wire that swallowed light without contempt. Naruto put his fingers near it and felt his heat lean. He drew back. Hinata, without looking, breathed, "Don't." In the same voice she used for falling and you're bleeding. "I wasn't going to," he whispered. "You were curious," she whispered back. "Same thing," Karen whispered, having the discussion on her face even if her mouth stayed closed. Naruto smiled because he'd been seen and still liked. The far ribs bore sigils that didn't move until you looked at them sideways. Then they suggest they could, if asked politely. The feather linework from the tunnel casket had cousins here. He took the casket out of his pouch and set it on the table because that felt like what the room wanted. It warmed as if relieved not to be someone's secret pocket. A charm on Hinata's belt flickered. She put 2 fingers on it and breathed a name Naruto had only heard once when Shien's message had folded the air of tea. Sunade's office into a shape that made paper jealous. "Priestess," Hinata murmured, and the charm warmed. A woman's voice came through soft and thin, like a letter that had learned to be sound. "The Uzumaki reliquary accepts presence. Not pressure. Heat. Yes, but not blast. Song. Yes, but not alone. Pair breath and light. Sneer at the bells. Do not boast. Shien says hello," Hinata said to the room. And even Tamari inclined her head a fraction to the absent priestess. The dome had that effect. It made everybody remember their better manners. Karen put her palm on the table by the casket, not touching the box. "Just sharing skin heat with the wood. 2-step trigger," she said. "One human pattern. One, not." Naruto didn't look at the heat under his sternum because there was nowhere to look. He matched Hinata's breath and let inventory go. Inhale, the lifting. Exhale, the settle. The casket's lid did not so much open as decide to be different about being closed. It shifted. Warmth slipped out without blast. A faint, bright smell like feathers that had never been dirty. Inside, resting on a bed of something that had been silk and was now memory, lay a band no wider than his thumb, made Fr. A pale metal that would have called itself dawn if metals named themselves. Feather sigils ran along it with no beginning and no end. Fu landed lightly with a little, "Oh," that wasn't greed or fear, just delight. Temari's eyes narrowed, calculating the politics of a thing without revealing whether she intended to play them. Karen's breath caught, a rare surrender. Hinata's hands were as steady as a level. Naruto didn't reach. He looked at Karen. She nodded once. "You should," she said. "And you shouldn't. Which means you will and I will complain, and Hinata will make you breathe while you do, and Tamari will count the exits. And Fu will hover and tell you if you look weird. I will absolutely provide commentary," Fu said solemnly. "Fine," Tamari said, equally solemn. "I will count exits and judge fashion." He reached. The band was warm, not hot. Its warmth felt like kindness, the kind that insists on truth. When he set it around his wrist, it shrank a hair, enough to declare attention, not enough to claim ownership. Heat under his sternum rose to meet it and did not smash into it. They touched like the moment between 2 notes when harmony is a possibility and not yet a fact. The dome changed. Not the air, not the light. The listening in the dome shifted the way a room does when an old friend steps in and you haven't seen them since the world broke and grew back. Naruto breathed. The band hummed, soft as fingers working a knot out of a muscle. He didn't push. He held. The feather sigils along his wrist warmed until he could feel their shape in his pulse. Hinata matched him without asking. The second rib on the north side of the dome lifted a fraction, just enough to make a seam that had not existed until 2 people had insisted on quiet together. Karen's eyes were GHT with the concentration of a gamer reading a new map. "There," she said, "stabilize." Tamari kept the air first neutral, then favoring the seam. Fu buzzed the ceiling, scattering dust that had thought it was a permanent citizen. Naruto stepped to the rib and touched fingers to the place where the wood had cracked when lightning ate the sky above this dome maybe a lifetime ago. He didn't push heat. He let a narrow thread of it slide off the band and down his bones into the wood. "Sun thread," his body suggested, like a reminder. The crack did not vanish. It knit. The dome sighed like a person who had stopped clenching their jaw after a year. Something outside took exception. Bell tones arrived in a pattern that wasn't random and wasn't careful. It was urgent. Shock spheres thudded onto the glass above and tried to link. The sound inside the dome twitched. The candles fluttered. The seam Naruto was touching threatened to unmake again. Of course, Tamari said calmly. They watched us go in and decided to be difficult. Fu rolled her shoulders. I'll go say hi. Wait, Hinata said, already moving to the south seam. If they link a net tight, you'll fly into a cage. Karen slid to the table and wrote a quick, untidy sigil on a strip of paper with such ferocity the ink smoked. Anchor this on the rib you like, ceiling boy. If the bells try to teach the room to forget, this will remind it to remember. On it, Naruto said, and anchored the tag with a press of thumb that left a small sunburst print in the paper. The first shock sphere linked with the second. Naruto felt the dom. Ease listening falter for a half a breath, then hold, the band on his wrist humming like a friend checking your pulse. Tamari stepped to the center and spread the fan, not wide, enough to control. She coaxed air up the candle gutters and through the seam like drawing a thread. The glass sang back reluctantly. Fu found a narrow shaft at the top and peeped through with one compound eye's worth of curiosity. 5, she reported. 3 with kites, 2 on foot. Bells are mean. Hinata had 3 paper tags between her fingers, each neat and precise. She passed one to Tamari, one to Karen, kept one for herself. Counter tones, she said. Short. Place them where the sound tries to knot. Naruto felt the heat in him balance on its toes. The band warmed. He opened his mouth and let the sound from the tunnel find him again, the knot song. The stubborn long note that was less a melody and more a refusal to be erased. Doncall, the room whispered back, not a label, a memory. He didn't shout. He filled the dome with a long breath that wanted to be a road. Hinata's breath folded into his without swallowing his. It was an almost ridiculous intimacy. 2 people insisting on existing at the same time, at the same pace. For the sake of wood and light and a ring of singing glass far above. The shock spheres faltered. The bell notes misfired, made untidy by a room that refused to be tidy for them. You shot up the shaft like a dart and burst into the daylight, wing petals snapping half lovely, half weapon. Hello, she sang, badly, intentionally, and shoulder-checked a kite so hard it spat its pilot without meaning to. He hit the glass with admirable poise and only a little regret. Tamari pinned the shock sphere nearest him with a gust shaped like a hand and rolled it into a puddle where it quenched and sulked. Karen moved like someone born to be at the edge of dangerous science. She slapped her counter-tone tag on a rib that had been preparing a sad noise and made it reconsider. The dome's hum stabilized. Outside, the world found the volume button and leaned on it. The foot soldiers hit the seam with long iron hooks and tried to pry the rib open. Hinata flowed to the weak point like water finding the lowest place. She didn't strike. She tapped the iron in a pattern Naruto didn't know and never wanted used on his bones. The hooks vibrated wrong. The men let go out of self-preservation rather than mercy. Naruto didn't ride the heat high. He said it carefully, balancing his breath on Hinata's count and the band's hum. It was like learning to hold a blade at the angle where it cuts clean instead of crushing. Fu, he called, voice steady across the bell stutter. Left kite's anchor, 3 spans out. Cut it. Yes sir. Fu crowed, and clipped the anchor line with a wing snap that left a smell like singed nettles. The kite went sideways. The shock net above the dome lost a note and sagged into confusion. The bells tried to tune it. The glass sang louder. Tamari jammed the fan into the floor at a slant and cranked. Basically, the weather. Air rose through the dome in a tight column that found the shaft and punched up into the net. The nets weren't sails and didn't want to be, they cried about it anyway. 2 shock spheres linked to nothing and went docile as stunned jellyfish. Karen, calm in the way only someone who's terrified and professional can be, pulled something tinny from her pocket that should not, by all rights, have been able to exist and do a useful thing. She flicked it open and it became a small hoop that glowed on one side and not on the other. Hold this, she said to Naruto. And don't drop it or it will singe all your sins into your palms. What if I have a lot of sins? Naruto asked, even as he took it because he trusted Karen's inventions Anyway he trusted the floor to mostly continue being floor. Then it will take a minute longer, Karen said, and planted the non-glowing side against the rib. When I say now, breathe. He didn't say he was already breathing. She knew. She said, now, and he exhaled. The hoop carried his breath into the wood like a promise the dome decided to believe. Above, the net sagged the last degree toward useless. Fu whooped pure, no filter joy and buzzed the remaining sphere until it gave up looking dignified and cracked itself on a seam just to stop being bullied. Silence fell the way rain stops, in a series of not quites that eventually add up to done. The kites drifted away, pilotless. The foot soldiers retreated, not because they feared pain, but because someone had told them to cut losses, and they were faithful. Naruto let the note go before his lungs asked him to. He didn't want to bleed the room dry. He touched the band. It was warm against bone. Karen sagged against the table with the sudden bonelessness of a person who had kept panic folded into functional shapes for 10 minutes too long. She caught herself and frowned at her own leg as if it had betrayed tradecraft. I'm fine. Hinata's hand hovered at Karen's elbow. Not touching, simply being there. Karen made a face and rolled her eyes but didn't move away from the available help. Fine, she repeated, fewer teeth this time. Tamari tapped the fan against her shoulder, casual like a cook leaning on a spatula after a good batch. They'll come back cleverer, she said. They learn. So do we, Naruto said, and realized he believed it more than he liked the sound of his own voice. Fu hung upside down from the shaft rim and grinned down at them, hair dangling, wings ticklish on the stone. This place is pretty. Can we keep it? We can try, Tamari said. Politics will have opinions. Politics always do, Karen said sourly. They show up late and take credit and write more rules. Hinata smiled small. We'll write better ones. They set up a watch anyway because pretty places attract bad decisions. They ate standing up with their backs to ribs that had been cracked by a storm and stitched by a boy's careful heat. When quiet finally arrived with its shoes off, they found the fire pool. It was misnamed. There was no flame. A sunken basin took the room's warmth and held it. The water inside it was clear and busy with its own purposes. If you cupped your hands in it, heat nested there like a bird trusting a palm. Naruto sat with his boots off and his feet in the pool. Hinata sat beside him and did the same. Tamari squatted with her elbows on her knees and made lists nobody could see. Karen lay on her back and threw a strip of cloth over her eyes and said, If I die, burn my notes. You won't die, Naruto said. I won't, Karen agreed. Unmoved. But in case, burn them. I have enemies I don't want to entertain after. Fu dropped beside the pool and let her fingers skim the surface. The water clung to her in beads that looked like they wanted to grow wings. They chased me for a week, she said without drama. The bells don't like me. I don't like them back. Join the choir, Tamari said dryly. Fu laughed at the pun like Tamari had meant to make it. She rolled her head toward Naruto and Hinata. You breathe together nice, she observed. Like a river and a bridge. Naruto made a noise that was not language. Hinata's cheeks warmed, and she didn't look away, and that was the braver choice. Thanks, Naruto said at last, because accepting kindness was also a kind of skill. He looked at Fu's wing petals. At the shoulder where a bell bruise spread like ink under skin. Does it hurt? Only when I think about it, Fu said cheerfully. So I don't. Karen lifted the cloth from one eye. Let me try something later. Not now. Later. She dropped the cloth again. Don't fly into any more bells while I'm laying here appreciating not bell. I make no promises, Fu said, which was almost a promise. Tamari stirred the pool with the edge of her fan and watched the ripples disagree with each other. You know they'll escalate, she said to no one particular in all of them. What we did here, he gestured with a line of her wrist that included the dome, the band, the quiet, this won't starve them of certainty. It will make them bring bigger forks. Then we learn to feed them something they choke on, Naruto said, not cruel. Just practical. Hinata didn't say be careful. Her hand found the hem of his sleeve and held it between finger and thumb, not pulling, just keeping the space honest. We can teach your heat to listen as well as burn, she said. Shien's charm hinted. Pair breath and light. Music lesson, he said. Hinata's eyes softened at the corners. Yes. They stayed until tea. He tapped the dome to remind them of schedules. When they squeezed back through the seam, the glass outside had turned from pewter to a kind of hard silver that made reflections lie. The kites were gone. Kat's team had netted 2 men in quiet knots and was asking them questions in a tone that implied answers were a good use of time. The wind had got bored and wandered off, leaving Temari to carry her own weather again. Naruto watched the horizon and tried to hold too many things in his head at once. The feather sigil band warming his pulse, the way Hinata's breath could teach his heat patience. The look on Fu's face when a cage didn't close the way it wanted, the noise Temari had made when the glass sang exactly the way she wanted it to. He thought of the man with the casket saying blasphemy like a diagnosis. He thought of Seime's name on Tsunade's desk, underlined, the way names get when they mean the one who will not be persuaded by spectacle. "Don't get quiet on me," Temari said without looking at him. "I'm thinking," Naruto said. "That's what I said," Temari replied. "Let me know when you start leading." He didn't bristle. He had been less precious about his pride lately. "What do you need?" he asked instead. "Lanes," Temari said, pleased that he'd asked a good question. "When the bells push, I need 3 running backs. If I hum through the glass here, I want Fu up there and Hinata there and you." She looked at him finally. "I want you to stop being the only thing on fire. Share it. Teach me how to shout in your key." The idea made him grin in a way that put splinters of fear in his mouth. "You'll hate it." "I already hate everything useful," Temari said, and patted his shoulder with a fan that could cut a house in half. "That's how I know it's useful." They ocked the glass until the boat made its stubborn way back to a curve of sand that hadn't yet decided to become mirror. A gull screamed about everything and nothing. Fu tracked it with her eyes, amused, and then threw her head back and screamed back, matching the gull so exactly it gave up dignity and fled. She preened, righteous. Hinata laughed aloud, rare and startled by her own sound. Naruto ed the moment next to a handful of others he wanted to remember when he was old enough to forget. The sail filled. The boat took them hand-sized quickly away from a place that would go on being beautiful and angry without them. Naruto stood at the bow again, the band warming his wrist with little sips. Karen bumped his shoulder with hers, wordless, apology for calling him out earlier, acceptance tea. He would go where trouble was as if trouble had invited him on purpose. He nodded at nothing and everything. They reached Konoha at a sun that had decided to be decent. The first person to meet them at the pier was not Tsunade, who had larger wars to fight than Docs, but Shizune with a stack of papers and a pen she wielded like a kunai. "How many?" she asked them, and meant in the way medics do. "How many of you and how many of them and how many decision points between?" "None dead," Temari said in the voice of a woman who doesn't gamble and therefore wins more than she should. "2 captured. 1 sulk." She kicked the dead shock sphere with the tip of her sandal. It made a sound like a pan that had given up being round. Shizune checked boxes. "Tsunade-sama will be in the war room when you're done desaltifying." "Naruto." She didn't scold, which was worse. "How many times did you pull on it?" He knew what it was. He considered lying and chose to be the shinobi he kept telling himself he wanted to be. "Enough to learn a little," he said. "Not enough to get stupid." Karen made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. Shizune, who could parse sensors in her sleep, raised one eyebrow. "He's right," Karen said grudgingly. Annoyingly, he listened more than he shoved. "Good," Shizune said. "Let's keep him on that side of the line." She looked at Fu next and softened. "You are the guest who breaks my bedsprings and laughs in my hospital." "You're welcome." Fu beamed. "I'm very good at being welcome." Hinata drifted close to Naruto as they climbed the steps away from the water. She didn't take his hand. That would make the moment heavy when all it needed to be was particular. "You sang well," she said. "I made a shape with my mouth and hoped the world occupied it," he admitted. She smiled, tilting toward him, not quite a lean. "That's singing." Tsunade's war room had a floor that hadn't always been a war room floor. It remembered parties under the old Hokage. And you could feel the ghosts of speeches in the planks if you stood dead center and shut your eyes. Naruto didn't. He stood to the left of center where he could see faces and exits and avoid becoming a speech. The map had pins he hadn't seen yesterday. The Pale Ministry wasn't only theirs now. Sand had pinned a caravan that had been asked impolitely to surrender its water rights in exchange for silence. Taki had grieved the theft of a set of prayer bells that had rung for storms and now rang to erase jutsu. A fishing village with a pretty name had pinned a missing, and it was a child. The pins made Naruto's skin feel 2 sizes too small. Tsunade took one look at their faces and adjusted her expression from "we are in control" to "we are in a fight and I see you." "Report," she said. Tamari reported with impolite precision. Hinata added the seam data in a tone that made it clear where the crucial inches had been. Karen didn't brag about the hoop or the tags, she noted them like weather. Fu broke in twice to explain a wing thing using her hands and was not shushed for it. Naruto saved his bit for last. He described the band and the way the dome had chosen to open under paired breath and not pressure. Tsunade listened without putting her hands in anything. When Naruto finished, she rested her knuckles on the table as if it were a cliff and she was choosing not to jump. "Good," she said, in the clipped way a woman gives a compliment that belongs to a team. "You bought us a place and took a toy they think is theirs. They won't forgive that." Naruto nodded. "We'll learn faster." Tsunade's gaze flicked to the band on his wrist and the place where his pulse jumped against the metal. "Learn smarter," she said. "Faster gets bodies buried." He accepted that without argument. It lodged and would sit there until it made him do something useful at the moment where doing nothing would feel easier. "Director," Kat asked from the wall, meaning, the ministry has one. "Who?" Tsunade tapped a point on the map that wasn't a city. It was a cliff nobody visited on purpose, with a spire on it that the map couldn't decide whether to draw. "Seimei," she said. "Iron Bell. Former monk. New certainty." Her mouth tried to curl, didn't. "He thinks he's saving the world from the part of us that gets loud when we're afraid." "Same," Naruto said, surprised into it. "He just picked different tools." "Exactly," Tsunade said, darkly pleased he'd bitten that hook. "Which means you can't beat him with volume. You beat him with choir." Fu's eyes went soft and bright. "I love choir," she said, and then looked offended at her own sincerity. "Not the robe kind. The road kind. People noise." Tamari snorted. "I'll make a road for your noise." Karen pushed her glasses up her nose and glanced at Naruto's wrist. Then his throat, then his mouth, because that's where breath exits, and she was a scientist with a poetic streak she refused to acknowledge. "We need to map his hum." The band added a register. "If we don't know where it cracks, he'll learn it for us." Hinata nodded, approval quiet and present. "Training," she said to Naruto. "Not harder. Different." "Fu will help," Fu declared. "I will shove you into the sky and if you fall I will laugh and then catch you." "Deal," Naruto said, because love languages come in varieties. Tsunade pushed the map away from the edge. "Eat," she told them. "Sleep for an hour if you can lie to your nerves. Then we open a small door and look at a storm." He didn't ask what storm. There would be a dozen. She would pick the one that would teach them the most for the least number of funerals. They filed out with the comfortable friction of people who had earned an hour. Outside, the village was itself. Arguments over apples in the market that ended in 2 apples. Kids daring each other to climb a wall and the wall pretending not to mind. Laundry on lines committing to the breeze. Naruto stood in the sun long enough to feel it find his skin and stick. The band hummed once, soft as a hand on his wrist. He looked down at it and didn't give it a name yet. He would have to earn that too. When twilight fell over the rooftops like a scarf, he met Hinata on the training field where the grass grows stubborn and 1,000 footprints have taught the ground what it is for. Fu arrived late on purpose and upside down. Tamari walked out of the wind like she'd commissioned it. Karen came carrying a stack of paper tags and a cup of something that smelled like it would fix you or kill you depending on dosage. They didn't talk about destiny. Hei talked about angles and counts and when to stop. Naruto stood where Hinata told him. He breathed when she breathed. He let the heat run a little between counts and then called it back because he had decided he wouldn't be a shinobi who only listened to himself. Tamari threw wind at him in narrow, mean lines to see if his feathered vectors could learn to redirect without brute force. Karen tapped the band twice when he began to shove instead of ask. Fu laughed at him when he fell and laughed with him when he didn't. Under the last light, a hawk wheeled over the field and screamed like the sky had a thought it wanted to share. Naruto tilted his head and listened. The heat under his sternum answered without words. He didn't understand. He didn't mind not understanding, for once. He would learn. The way you learn people. The way you learn cities. The way you learn a song by singing it with others until it stops being yours and starts being something you carry together. Far away, a bell rang up a cliff. It was not a threat. Not yet. It was a statement of attendance. Naruto flexed his fingers and looked at the hands that would have to hold heavier things than staffs and caskets. He breathed in and matched the count. He breathed out and let the band hum against bone. The village lights came on in ribbons. He felt the shape of the next day press against the edge of the night and did not flinch. He had friends with him and a bird under his ribs that wanted to be a sunrise, and for now that was enough to make any storm make room. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. Monastery of Bells. The mountains turned the wind into a language that only stubborn people heard. The path stitched along a gray spine and then refused to be called a path at all, just a suggestion stamped into slate by feet. That liked the idea of pilgrim more than soldier. Naruto climbed until his calves had opinions and then climbed more, because the monastery was built for men who believed hard things made better truths. Don't race the altitude, Tamari said without looking back. She had the fan in its travel strap and the posture of someone who trusted rocks more than people. It likes to win. I'm not racing, Naruto said, and then had to pause because the wind shoved a handful of cold into his mouth and asked if he wanted to choke on it. He spat it out politely. Hinata moved a half step off his shoulder, all small adjustments and breath counts. Eyes in the wide field of Byakugan, marking the next switchback as a kindness not a command. 2 turns, she said, soft enough that the mountain might keep the secret. Then a shelf with prayer wheels. Karen had tied her red hair tight under a scarf that had a grudge against the sky. She unrolled a thin map and jabbed it with her finger in 3 places. Sound corridors, she said. Wind organs set in the stone. Not bells. They teach you to walk their way. If you don't, they tell on you. Fu walked where the ledge had never intended anyone to walk, boots half off the rock. Giggling when the drop tried to be serious about consequences. Chomei's wing petals flexed under her jacket in small, insect-bright ticks that made the air around her feel busy. This place is rude, she announced. Delighted. I love it. The shelf appeared as Hinata had promised. A broad ledge shouldered into the cliff, ringed by prayer wheels polished to a shine by hands. The monastery clung above in tiers. Suspended bridges like harp strings, courtyards punched into the stone with the efficiency of a people who had learned to nest in storms. Bells hung under eaves in neat rows. None moved. It was mid-morning, the light thin, the sky deciding to be blue later. There were people, actual civilians, crossing the bridges with baskets, faces turned against the wind. Kids with shaved heads chased each other along a slate lip, sandals whispering. Women in gray talked over a pile of greens someone had convinced to grow in stone. A monk poured water from a copper pot into a basin, and the sound disappeared before it reached their ears, swallowed by the mountain. Naruto stopped on the shelf and watched long enough to earn the right to say he'd seen them, not just counted obstacles. Not a fortress, he said. A town that learned to wear bells like armor. Temari's mouth did a half-approval that counted as praise. So we don't kick doors, she said. We walk like we belong. Karen twitched the scarf tighter. We don't belong. Then we act like we're delivering nothing dangerous, Tamari said. She lifted one of the prayer wheels and spun it with a finger, casual, respectful enough to not be rude. The carved script blurred and glittered. The wind answered with a low hum. Tamari listened and adjusted the wheel's spin a fraction slower. The hum settled into something her shoulders allowed. Naruto copied her without copying. He put his palm against the next wheel and let it carry his heat in the faintest, politest way you offer someone tea without an expectation. The wheel warmed. The hum tried to taste his heat and got flustered when it couldn't drink it all. Hinata spun a third wheel with 2 fingers. All 3 tones found a place to sit in the air without arguing with each other. They walked through the monastery gates like people meant to be there. Nobody stopped them because their bodies had learned the corridor rhythm in the first minute, and the mountain respects competence even when it doesn't like you. Inside, it was neat and deliberate and alive. Bells everywhere but none rung, like a tongue held behind teeth until a word matters. Kids acted steps under the close eye of a teacher who slant-smiled when Fu stuck her tongue out at a bell and then remembered she was a guest and tucked the tongue away like contraband. The wind organ too, NNELS whispered around them with thin music that had nothing to do with melody and everything to do with whether your weight hit the 4th stone on the 8th beat. Hinata's voice at Naruto's ear wasn't even a voice. It was a breath shape. Here, now, step. He matched her count and felt his heat align with the wheel tones they'd left behind, a low line under their steps. The band on his wrist warmed and hummed once, not proud, present. They didn't go for the central spire with its great bell staffs hung in racks like oars for some metaphysical boat. They cut into the frame of the place, the RTS that made sound into a wall, the foundry, the tuning rooms, the little shallow basins where bell tongues were strung and taught to behave. Tamari guided them by the weather in the rooms, the way he had pulled where metal had been worked recently, the way drafts persisted where doors had been opened often. Karen stopped them at a corridor that looked like every other corridor, which meant it wasn't. She bent, pressed 2 fingers to the stone, and winced. Null tone, she whispered. Low key. Not enough to hurt. Enough to teach your body that flinching is polite. It runs through the walls here. Hinata brought the Byakugan to full bloom. Her eyes frowned. A child. 2. Behind that wall. Class. A teacher. The tone touches them and moves on. She sounded angry the way quiet people get when the world says children are maps for your ideology. Naruto moved forward because anger that doesn't find a job starts to break your hands from the inside. He touched the wall where Karen's fingers had found the tone. It didn't hurt. It asked him to be smaller. He wasn't insulted. He was disappointed. Tag, he asked. Karen already had one out, written messier than her pride allowed. Short term, she said. It'll hiccup the tone, not kill it. Seimei would feel it die. Hiccup buys. She glanced at Hinata. 2 minutes, Hinata said, exact. The teacher would hear nothing. But the audience behind the wall would hear quiet for once. Their bodies would stop flinching for 2 minutes. Naruto nodded. Hiccup. Karen's mouth softened like she wanted to say it had always been 2 minutes that fixed things. Not a triumph but a reprieve that changed the angle of the next hour. She slapped the tag to the stone and it vanished the way good tools do when they belong more to a place than to a person. Hinata watched the class. They're laughing, she whispered. It feels like relief. Tamari touched the fan's edge to Naruto's sleeve. You're here for a foundry, kid, she murmured. Don't start a religion. He grinned, abashed. Just a hobby. They found the foundry by listening for the place the wind tried to pretend it wasn't proud of. It was a tall chamber with ribs of iron and racks of bells at every stage, blank, half-born. Engraved, shamed into tune. A slit high up gave a blade of light that carved dust into visible threads. 2 men worked in silence that could only belong to a room T. Hat had learned to mean more than a room. Both wore simple gray and the look of craftsmen building a fence out of music. A 3rd man stood by the cooling basin. His staff leaned against the rim. It was the one from the report. The one that had put out walls in other countries and made Jiraiya curse in new languages. It was taller than Naruto and banded with careful iron. The bell inside was a dead color. It made the air around it think too much about being obedient. Seimei, Naruto asked, though he knew. There are men whose names gather to them like leaves blown into a corner. Everything ends up there. Whether it was going there or not. The man turned. His eyes were not fanatical. They were tired in a disciplined way, like he had spent evenings years ago deciding whether to be cruel and hose it because he didn't want to agree with luck again. He had a face that used to laugh. It hadn't recently. You shouldn't be here, Seimei said. His voice was not a bell, nor a threat. It was what blacksmiths sound like when they tell you not to touch something dumb. This is a workshop. Your presence will make what we make worse. It already is, Tamari said, mock warm. We came to make it better. You brought a fan to a forge. Seimei replied. Wind to sound, Tamari said. Neighbors. Karen's eyes flicked to the staff, then to the racks of bells. Null harmonics at 3 registers, she said. Stacked so you swallow your own breath without knowing you're hungry. She looked back to Seimei with open contempt. You aim this at children. Only at children who will become weapons, Seimei said calmly. Sound is gentler than flame. Nobody gentle talks about children like that, Naruto said, cheerful because his fear made him overcorrect. He stepped forward toward the staff to T close enough to feel its texture with his heat. Hinata matched him without touching. Fu disappeared upward with a little insect bright zip, she liked rafters. Tamari exhaled like a wind from nowhere. And then nowhere again. The fan didn't move, but the room's drafts forgot themselves and remembered what open windows meant. Seimei lifted the staff. He didn't ring it. He placed it, very deliberately, between Naruto and the racks of bells. Turn around, he said. Walk back out. If you leave what is in you here, I will let you go without making you hear the bell from the inside. No, Naruto said politely. He looked past Seimei into the ribs of the foundry. He could feel a seam in the floor where spills had been swept away too well, as if regret had been lacquered over until it shone. He could smell iron. Under the iron he could smell dust on feathers. Seimei did not sigh. He gave a small nod, like a boxer who recognizes someone else has chosen the fight and decides to be professional about it. He brought the staff up and rotated it. The bell inside was silent, but the staff's banded iron made a skin-level hush that crawled over Naruto's knuckles. The men at the mold slid away in at practiced way of people who have stood too close to other people's arguments before. One dipped his head to Seimei, respect, not obedience. They took a door at the back that looked like a shelf until it wasn't there. Hinata said very softly, he can break the floor tone. Don't let him stage you on it. Naruto nodded minutely. He didn't try to be fast first. He stepped in and let his heat rise a breath. Then held it just under skin. Plumage guard, tight, reserved. He moved at a measured clip that made his ankle want to show off. Seimei watched his feet, not his eyes. Naruto liked him better for that. Seimei struck. No loudness. Just a small angle and a precise touch. The staff's end kissed Naruto's elbow with surprising grace. The bell inside did nothing. The wall behind Naruto trembled anyway. The pressure made his plumage guard think about shrinking. He refused the shrink by form, not force. He set his shoulder under the heat and let it unfurl in a narrow strip down his forearm, feathers described by heat, not seen. The next brush hit the strip and slid away like rain on oil. Seimei's mouth didn't move, but the lines beside it allowed that he was interested. Who are you saving? Naruto asked, and stepped in enough that his breath matched the rhythm of Seimei's ribs. Those who can't survive you, Seimei said, and stepped around him without touching, rotating the staff so the dead bell's cage framed the world different. The move wasn't an attack. It was a rewrite. Naruto's instinct to dash met a half-second of thick air. He didn't push through. He stepped back. Hinata's count gave him a window across the move. He watched Seimei's foot and saw it listen to the floor. Seimei walked like someone who didn't consider himself heavy enough to matter. Tamari made a weather change so subtle it was almost prayer. A draft crossed at ankle height, a tone that wanted to interrupt a choice. Naruto chopped at the staff not with power but with angle. Seimei let him. Once, so Naruto could feel how heavy the iron wasn't. The weight was in the tone, not the metal. The bell inside remained untouched. The outside told the room how to swallow you. He had to do something or he'd start thinking too much. So he did the thing that had put him under a ceiling. He put his body between the staff and the racks. He was too close for tidiness now. Seimei worked well at range. Naruto did his best when he could feel a heartbeat that wasn't his. Your master taught you to hit what moves the least, Seimei said, and the staff kissed Naruto's shin in a way that would make it tantrum later. Mine taught me to make men move wrong. He twisted the staff and Naruto's balance betrayed him for one ugly half-breath. You think you are fire. You are a boy who will make cities scream if we let you love the sound of yourself. Naruto's laugh came out softer than he meant. I don't like my voice that much, he said. He threw an elbow to cover the stutter his balance had decided to experience. He hit the staff and the heat down his forearm changed shape without asking his permission. The plumage guard feathered out and then angled. The force glanced. It wasn't a shield. It was a vector. He grinned despite himself. Okay, he said to his own bones. That's neat. Seimei's eyes cut to the angle and back, curiosity a knife he was not afraid to use on himself. Who taught you that? You did, Naruto said, honest and annoying. Up in the rafters, Fu reported without words that two novices had crawled under a bench and were currently being patient and terrified. Hinata's breath shifted too, an instruction Naruto had learned to hear swelling under the quiet. Mind the corners. He stepped left and kept Seimei's line of force away from the bench. He took a tap on the ribs to do it. The tap revealed an ache that would be a bruise. The heat under his sternum lifted its head in protest. He pressed it down with his hand, palm over band. Tamari rolled the air along the wall like someone smoothing a blanket. Karen's whispers touched Naruto's ear. His left hand, 2 fingers old break. Pressure there changes the resonance. She didn't say how she knew. Sensors know or they don't. Naruto didn't aim for the fingers. He aimed for the space that would make Seimei use them. He drove in with an ugly little knee that any back alley would have been proud to claim. Seimei blocked with the staff. ND took his fingers off the sweet grip to do it. The staff's hum stuttered. Hinata reached 1 2 3. Naruto dropped his shoulder and sang. It wasn't pretty, but it had become less a refusal or a made thing. A tone that wanted to line up with the band's hum and the room's better self, not force the room to kneel. The staff's hush met Naruto's long note and didn't know whether to reply. He foundry air stopped hating them for a second. A child behind the bench coughed. It was the smallest sound in a room that had been shrugging off loudness for years. Naruto saw Seimei hear it, not with his ears. With his choices. Seimei's next strike was angled away from the bench in a way that made Naruto stop liking him as an enemy and start being troubled by him as a person. Mercy that has calculus behind it is still mercy. It was a crack he could wedge with something real. If you're saving people, Naruto said between steps, why did you build a place where children learn not to breathe? Seimei's face did a small human thing like an eyelid flinch. Because the world burns when boys like you get praised for breathing. Tamari blew a small snort out her nose and pushed her wind under tea. He benched so the kids could feel a draft that wasn't afraid of them. Fu slid down a rope, upside down, and made a face at the nearest bell tongue like she had just bitten lemon rind. The bell tongue had the audacity to look ashamed. Karen had moved to the mold racks with an expression that made safety codes jealous. She found the tuning wedges and flipped them, not to sabotage, but to give the bells a type B day. It made the next 3 notes the staff tried to pull out of the room go, not wrong, exactly. Indifferent. She slapped a tag on the cooling basin that told water to remember the temperate. You're it liked and not the one men wanted it to have. The water obeyed, stubborn. Seimei understood what was happening the way a general understands he's already lost a hill and the rest is just calendar. He shifted from art to violence not angrily but with relief. The staff came down in an arc designed to make bodies kneel. Naruto angled the feathered vectors. His heat asked to be thrown, not held, and the staff skidded. Sparks scolded the floor. The band warmed and whispered a word that felt like the first half of a word he'd been trying to say since the tunnel. Dawn. And then Seimei kicked him in the thigh and the word went away in favor of pain. Sorry, Naruto said, sincerely, to his thigh. He took the hit and used the angle of the skidding staff to helm Seimei into the wrong place, a shlee. CE of floor where the null tone made human ankles democratize all decisions. Seimei took one bad step in 20 years. Naruto put his palm to the staff and let a threading of heat, not a burn, run along the iron bands and find the little bell's cage. The heat didn't melt, it tightened. Sun thread through wire. The cage sang a noise like regret, then quieted. The dead color got deader. Seimei wrenched the staff away and danced a step that was a little, just a little, human. He looked at the children under the bench and then at Naruto. You will fail somewhere with more bodies, he said. I'd rather you do it here with only mine. I don't want yours either, Naruto said, and then the air changed. It didn't come from the bells. It came from the sky deciding it had been quiet out of courtesy and would now stop pretending it was anyone's guest. The light went thin. The ribs of the foundry made a lattice of shadow across Seimei's face and Naruto's hands and Karen's tags and Hinata's breath and Temari's fan and Fu on the rope upside down making a noise that was part giggle and part uh-oh. The sound was not a bell or a hammer or a human thing. It was pressure changing. It made the dust in Naruto's nose think about kneeling. Someone stepped onto a bridge outside and the whole monastery knew it because the bridge remembered the weight of kings. The door that had been a shelf became a door and then became a wind. The man who came through was tall in the way the mountain was tall, not something a measuring stick could bully. His hair was storm black and pinned with a simple iron clasp. He wore just enough armor to keep honest gravity from suing him for indecency. His eyes were the color of a sky that was thinking about being blue and then laughed and reconsidered. He didn't look at Seimei first. That would have been melodrama. He looked at the bells and the children and Hinata and the band on Naruto's wrist and the way Naruto's heat had turned into angles instead of show. He ranked them without being cruel about it. Then he smiled at Seimei like two men in a bar who had promised each other a fight before they knew who would win. Tenroku, Seimei said, and Naruto felt every bell in the monastery listened to the way the name made the air feel. Tenroku's voice carried a thunder that had put on a shirt and tried to be polite for 5 minutes. You keep interesting company, he told Seimei. I came for the bell staff blueprints and the boy whose back refuses to make friends with ceilings. Naruto put a hand up. Hi, he said, that's me. Tenroku's smile liked him. That made all Naruto's warning systems go off. Nice men who were good at killing are harder to fight than any other kind. You sound like you should be louder, Tenroku said. Don't worry, up there, he tilted his chin at the sliver of sky. The wind will take care of volume. Not here, Seimei said. He slanted a look at the bench where small feet had stopped being brave and started being kids. Outside, Tenroku didn't nod. He looked grateful. He turned and walked back through the door that had been a shelf like someone in no particular hurry because the air was his and rooms agreed to his schedule. He didn't ring a bell. The bells thought about ringing and then checked themselves. Tamari moved without twitching. Fu, she said, and made a hand sign like someone ordering soup. Soup, Fu said happily, even though she didn't know what soup meant in this context. She shot up the shaft before Tamari could second-guess humor. Hinata came to Naruto's side and simply stood there. He didn't look at her. He felt the count she said out of habit. In 2, 3, 4, his heat answered. The band warmed a fraction like a bird making its mind about a branch. Karen had a handful of tags and a handful of warnings she didn't want to use all at once. Don't stay under him, she said. He's a hawk who learned how to write essays about it. Fancy hawk, Naruto said, and then the 2 minutes of reprieve. Time he had allowed himself ended and he had to be movement again. He followed Tenroku out onto the bridge because men like Tenroku always take you where you have least control. The bridge was a span across a rocky throat. Wind shoved up and down it like people arguing on stairs. Tenroku didn't posture. He didn't ask stupid questions like do you know who I am? He trusted that the air had done that for him. He kicked off the bridge with one toe and the tail of his cloak wrote a line in the wind that any child with a stick would spend a summer trying to copy. He went up. Fu yelled I got him, overhead and giddy. And then yelped when Tenroku blurred and reminded her that there are speeds you don't get alone. He didn't hit her. He took her wind. He took the air around her and made it surprise her lungs. She coughed, recovered, turned the cough into a laugh on purpose, and juked out of his slipstream. Naruto went after him and knew he was going to be outclassed and went anyway because you can't learn speed by reading about it. He let wing step gather under his feet like a joke only he got. The world turned into distances he could cross by willing to be at the other side. The band hummed, with a thin music that wanted to grow teeth. Up, Tenroku called, very high and very steady, and Naruto obeyed out of psychological necessity. There was no ground under them, only a drop that had never bothered to end. The monastery fell away like a toy someone might be proud of if they could stand outside their pride. Naruto's ribs felt small. The air did not. The wind here was thin as a lie. He reached for his heat and it rose the way heat does when it considers whether it belongs in the sky. Tenroku wove the space around them. He didn't attack first. He drew. He made paths with pressure had asked Naruto to choose the wrong lanes. Naruto tried to be stubborn. He almost pulled it off until Tenroku's left hand, the one that wore a ring that didn't glitter because the sky considers glitter beneath it, twitched. And the thin air made a correction without telling Naruto it was going to. He slid into a channel of wind that carried him into exactly where Tenroku had meant to meet him. Not yet, Tenroku said pleasantly, and tapped Naruto under the rib in a way that made the world change rooms. The tap wasn't brutal, it was instructional. It shoved Naruto's heat out of its chair and made it sit on the floor for a breath. Naruto exhaled and met Hinata's count in his head and let the heat climb the walls and sit back down. He flared plumage guard tight and tried a sprint across a narrow current. Tenroku was there already, Smiling, not mocking, he had the good teacher's grin when a student runs even after falling. You listen, he said, half a compliment. I have friends who make me, Naruto said. Then cut left and up because sometimes being charming buys you an inch. Tenroku's hand opened. Talons aren't supposed to happen to people. On him, they were honest. They were a pressure sharpened to shape, not a costume. He slashed the air and the air got out of the way and Naruto's body discovered a new category of surprise. Feathered vectors angled on pure panic. The talon did not rip him. It went past and he had a half second to be grateful to every idiot move he had done in a practice yard on purpose. Fu slipped in from his blind side, because joy is daring. Tag, she sang, and palmed Tenroku's shoulder with the kind of touch pranksters gift benches before rain. Tenroku laughed, spun like joy was contagious, and Fu had to invent a new turn in the air to get out of the reach of joy that cut. Temari's voice came up the gorge in a narrow ribbon of sound engineered to not evaporate at altitude. Stop playing, she said to the wind. Give me a line. Naruto caught the line like a thrown rope. It was not wind like weather. It was instruction. A thin stream of pressure that liked his feet and felt like it wanted him to succeed for reasons spirits don't tell you. He put his soles on it and ran where it told him, and for 3 steps the world forgave him for not being Tenroku. Tenroku allowed it. He let Naruto think about the idea of lane and then he collapses the lane with a shoulder dip that changed the mountain's mind. Naruto fell. Not down, not yet, but into a place where the air turned indifferent. He reflexively reached for rebirth pulse and the heat scream. Ed know like someone you love when you take a corner too fast. He didn't. He took the fall with ugly dignity, body at bad angles that meant bruises will pack a suitcase. Tenroku didn't chase him all the way. He beat his wings once. He didn't have wings, but the air believed he did, and belief is sometimes physics, and he flashed above Naruto and cut a line across the sky so thin Naruto only saw it because his eyes watered. That line became thunder. It didn't crash. It scolded. It went through Naruto's plumage guard and made his heat flinch. He tasted metal. He grinned anyway because he's a menace. That way and people like Tenroku respect menace more than compliments. Not yet, Tenroku repeated, and then did something Naruto recognized as mercy and hated. He took Naruto's shoulder and placed high back on the bridge with a gust that set tiles singing. Naruto stumbled, knee barked, hands empty. He put a palm down to steady and hearing came first, sight second. Bells that hadn't rung in hours rumbled in their racks like birds on a wire deciding to leave. Seimei had stepped out onto the bridge too, staff in hand, caught between a loyalty that was ideology and a hospitality that was older than he admitted. Hinata was there before Naruto could say her name. Her hand hovered at his elbow, not touching, telling him the ground was a place. He stood by borrowing her breath. Tamari leaned Agai, NST the bridge rope in the way of someone who was pretending to be at ease to cut distance with humor. Karen took one look at him and threw a tag away unflung. She calculated they'd need it later, and not for stopping bleeding you could bandage. Tenroku hung in the air above them, not straining, not tired, like the piece of sky he owned was on a long-term lease. You have angles, he said down to Naruto. You don't have climb yet. You don't have economy. You spend body like a boy buying candy on market day. I like candy, Naruto said, because it was either be glib or respect a man who would tear the roof off Konoha if he got bored. Tenroku's smile made the air think about being happy. I'll teach you economy, he said carelessly, which to a boy like Naruto is an invitation and a threat and a prophecy. Find me at the aerolith before the rains. If you bring only yourself, I will break you quickly. If you bring all of them, he tilted his head and the entire monastery's sound bent Uru. ND the weight of his attention, it will be interesting. We're already interesting, Fu yelled from high and left. You are charming, Tenroku said, and plucked a shock sphere out of nowhere like a bad magician doing a trick right. He crushed it in one hand without looking at it to show that he considered the pale ministry's toys beneath his weather. Then he slid his gaze to Seimei. Stop teaching children to flinch. Teach them to bow. It's kinder. No, Seimei said, and it would have been easier to hate him if he had said yes. His grip changed on the staff. He did not raise it. He planted it. You have already slaughtered enough in the name of kindness. Tenroku's eyes cooled a degree. Names, he said, soft in a way that made the mountain pretend not to exist. Villages without names on your maps, Seimei said. And the words had the weight of a man who found a ledger and decided to keep it even though it made his hands dirty. Tenroku didn't apologize. War ends faster when one hand holds the sky, he said. If you want to object, then beat my hand. If you can't, and you cannot, then kneel or get clever at small scales and do not make yourself a project for me. Naruto, feeling like a dog who had been ignored during an argument between wolves, cut in with perfect timing to be killed. We're very good at small scales, he said. He smiled in a way that had gotten him pulled out of bars and thanked by old ladies. And we make bad projects. Tenroku's eyes flicked to him. The smile returned for half a breath. Aerolith, he said one last time, and then the wind forgot they been breathing it together and threw him sideways into absence. He was not there. The bells did not ring. They thought about ringing and decided it would only flatter him. Silence aligned. Karen allayed her terror and shook her hands as if tips of fingers had collected static. Hinata let her hand drop from Naruto's elbow to her side, where it could stop showing and start being. Fu popped upright against the cliff face and clung there like a bright insect thinking about its next landing. Seimei looked at Naruto without hostility, exactly as if Naruto had claimed his doorstep with muddy shoes. And an apology and he was going to say no for a long, courteous hour. You broke the foundry for a day, he said. You could have burned it for a year. You chose less. Something like confusion touched his voice. Why? Because there are kids in your hallways, Naruto said. Because people eat soup here. Because this room makes bells and I don't know how to fix soup when I ruin it. Seimei looked at his staff like it could answer the kind of question he didn't know how to ask anyone human. You will go to him, he said, not a thing in question. Yes, Naruto said, honesty because Hinata had set his breath to it and it was too difficult to be polite and lie. Seimei's jaw tightened the way it does when someone chooses a path you could map and still hate. Then your village will prepare its loved ones for a funeral and call it necessary. No, Naruto said, softer. He touched the band at his wrist. It seemed too small to be what it was. We'll make the sky a choir. He won't like that. Seimei's mouth tilted. It wasn't a smile, but the ghost of the man who had once laughed looked out and listened to the idea like it wanted to know what it would sound like. Choirs fight badly when the first arrow arrives, he said. Not as a lesson, as a warning. Then we'll build shields that sing, Temari said, flicking the fan open and closed once. She had heard Naruto's idea before he had made it. Karen rubbed her thumb along the edge of a tag and studied Seimei like you study a strange dog. Which bite is ideology, which is fear. Your bells are better than your lies, she told him. If the kid runs off a cliff, he'll take the leash knit with him. Come stop me from doing my job if you like. Otherwise get out of my light. Seimei's eyes flicked to Karen's forehead where a child had once cut her hair too short and the world had never returned it exactly. He notched the staff against the stone and considered whether walking away would make him a coward or a general. He chose to be Ost to an extent that would not shame him. You have until the snowline, he said to Naruto. Then I will come, and if you are not done with your choir, I will show you how silence keeps a village alive. Naruto nodded once. Seimei swept the staff up and sideways with a clean movement that made the foundry door forget it had been pretending to be a wall. He went inside without looking back, not because he didn't care, but because care would make choices worse. Fu slid down and landed next to Naruto with a hop. That was a hawk made out of sky and scolding, she said, odd. I want to bite him. Don't, Karen said flatly. Your dentist hates me already. Hinata's fingers brushed Naruto's wrist where the band hummed low. She didn't ask if he was okay. She counted quietly to be sure the answer would be yes later. Your angles were better, she said. You're listening. And my not dying, he said, attempting light. That too, Hinata said, and this time her mouth's corner approved of his attempt. They left the foundry quieter than they had arrived. Temari took the lead back through the sound corridors, and this time the wind organ didn't feel like a test. It felt like a conversation they had joined on time. Naruto kept his heat so close to his skin it felt like an undershirt and not a flame, and the band kept humming with approval and a kind of suspicion that terrible aunts have and they find you making tea the right way by accident. On the shelf with the prayer wheels, a child with a shaved head stared at Naruto like a puzzle he'd been given without a box picture. Naruto spun a wheel slow and steady and made the hum match Hinata's breath. The child smiled and spun his wheel with the same care, then ran off because kids will always choose running over percussion once the novelty wears off. Down on the lower ridge, Kat and her team waited like chiseled shadow. The look she gave Naruto was inventory and affection with barbed wire around it. "You're not dead," she said. "Accurate," Naruto said. "We made a friend." He nodded at the sky where Tenroku was not. Kat grunted. "I knew you'd do something upsetting." Her gaze flicked to Temari, who shrugged a sand shrug. "I brought the boy back. He was not like this when I found him, but also yes he was." Konoha got bigger as they descended the spine. The village shoulders were square. Smoke made a dozen small announcements that belonged to dinners and not to war. Naruto loosened his jaw and then had to unloosen it again when he smiled at nothing. "You're thinking loud," Karen said, because it was her job to scold you for having a brain in public. "I'm thinking about lanes," Naruto said. "Temari makes wind into lines. Hinata makes my breath into a metronome. Fu makes gravity jealous. You make tags go against their better judgment. We can build a road in the sky he can't own. You'll still fall," Temari said, practical. "Then I'll learn how to hit the ground like I meant it," Naruto said. Hinata's hand found his sleeve, light. It wasn't a promise. It was a line. He slid 2 fingers along the seam without looking and felt the band hum once hard enough to make his bones echo. The sound turned thin air behind his sternum into something like stamina. They reached the gate at the hour when Konoha smells of fry oil and laundry water and the fire in Tsunade's office that never goes out. Shizune intercepted them. With a list she'd pretended to stop making 3 hours ago. "Living?" she asked, and ticked boxes without waiting for them to lie. "Seimei," Temari said. Shizune nodded, unsurprised. "He used to write letters to an old monk I knew. Argument letters. The kind you keep even when you win. I'll tell Tsunade." She looked at Naruto last. "And you?" "Me," he said. She thwacked his shoulder mildly with the back of her clipboard. "Eat first. Then report. If you faint, I'm sending you to bed without the part where Tsunade stares." "That's my favorite part," Naruto said. Hinata elbowed him soft. "Eat," she said as if the word had seals in it. They ate in the loud comfort of Ichiraku because some victories count as knowing where to sit when you're too tired to sit anywhere else. Chuki nodded like he was pleased with the sum of them. Fu stole a boiled egg with a movement that would have impressed pickpockets. Karen pretended not to enjoy anything and then enjoyed it in spite of herself. Temari pretended the noodles weren't as good as sand food and then burned her mouth because she ate too fast for someone pretending. Naruto's band hummed with a small regularity that made the ramen steam look like a ghost song. He slurped and felt the heat in him store what it could for later. Tsunade listened. He told the fight straight and left out every place where fear had made him funny. She didn't erupt except to tell Shizune to pin the aerolith on the map with a yellow tack that meant hazard and opportunity in the same breath. The aerolith wasn't on any map. That was the point. You find a floating rock by learning to stand up in storms. "And Seimei?" Tsunade asked. "He doesn't want to kill us," Naruto said. "He'll do it if it makes his ledger even. He'll feel terrible. He'll keep doing it anyway." He scratched at the band. Then stopped scratching because it felt like disrespect to an elder even if the elder was a piece of metal. "He told me to finish before the snowline." "Merciful deadline," Temari said. "Rude delivery." Tsunade sighed the sigh of a woman who had learned to organize hope into rolls and put them on shelves. "You are absolutely not going to the aerolith alone," she said. "You will build lanes and acquire and you will use that head you keep out in the wind instead of under a hat." She jabbed a finger at the map. "We'll hit the null choir net nodes before he can make a lattice over my village. Temari, you'll figure out how to make wind into a grid. Hinata, you'll convince the boy's heat to use its inside voice. Karen, you'll invent something I will call contraband when the press asks. Fu will throw him," Fu said brightly. "And then catch him." "Perfect," Tsunade said. "Make it look like training and not negligence." They laughed because you have to. Spend laughter somewhere or it earns interest and drowns you later. When the room emptied and the maps keep being maps after the people who made them go home, Naruto and Hinata walked out into a night that hadn't decided whether to be cold. He didn't ask her to come to the training field. She didn't ask him if his fear made his heat enthusiastic. He stood where patchy grass had learned to grow back. Kay and he matched her breath because it was now a thing he did without thinking. She took the band in 2 fingers as a medic checking a pulse would and felt the hum. Her eyes closed on one blink longer than a blink. What? He asked. You're listening, she said. It likes you when you do. He stared at the sky where Tenroku had made a line thin enough to be noticed only by people who train in noticing. He flies like he owns the word, above. Hinata made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had more air. We don't need to own it, she said. We just need to rent it for a while. Month to month, Naruto said. Till the rains, she said. And then, he asked. Then, Hinata said, and finally looked at him instead of the sky, we give it back. That's the difference. He looked at her, longer than he should and then looked away because looking is its own language and he didn't want to speak until he had a grammar that wouldn't embarrass him. He stretched his hands and the heat in him stretched like a cat. Feathered vectors settled into angles that remembered Seimei. He whispered thanks he didn't mean Seimei to hear. A bell rung far off, domestic and honest. The village settled its shoulders and went on being itself. The mountain took the sound and ate the echo, because mountains keep secrets for free. Tomorrow would be lanes and wind and the ugly, useful work of learning to fall without making your friends do the catching too often. The day after that would be worse and better. Somewhere above the cloud line, a rock waited in the jet stream and a man with talons polished his patience. Naruto looked up until his neck reminded him to stop. He breathed in with Hinata's count and let out what he didn't need. He could smell dust on feathers again, but this time it didn't mean ruin. It meant readiness. It meant someone was going to burn and it was going to be the part of him that wanted to set everything on fire just because it could. He grinned at the night because he was not a boy who knew how to be solemn about good things. Let's build a road, he said. Let's build a choir, Hinata said. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. The band hummed. The grass complained and grew. The village lit small squares of gold against the dark and called it a plan. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. Aerolith Rising. The training field never stayed flat when Tamari was in charge. She drew lanes into air with the fan the way surveyors draw roads on maps nobody agrees to yet. Thin streams of pressure bent across the grass in threads you felt in your ankles more than your face. Naruto set his soles on a stream and let it carry him, then stepped off early because stepping off early taught you what falling tasted like when it's still a choice. Again, Tamari called, bored on purpose. You made the third step honest. The second was gossip. Fu rocketed past upside down, giggling. Stop talking mean to the air and it'll like you. It already likes me, Tamari said, and Ru a crosscurrent at Naruto to see if he'd panic. He didn't. He angled his feathered vectors, that new habit of heat becoming geometry along his forearms, and let the gust slide off him in a clean shimmer. The band at his wrist hummed once, approving and suspicious in the same breath, like a senior relative watching you stir a pot. Hinata kept count without counting out loud. Her breath made a room anywhere she stood, and Naruto had learned to live inside it while moving like he meant to be outdoors. Hold the lift after you leave the lane, she said. Don't try to carry the lane with you. In watched with a notebook of tags jammed under her arm and a pencil behind her ear. She didn't take notes. She watched like a censor with her hands busy so she wouldn't clench them. Pulse, not shove, she said to Naruto, not looking up. Every time you brood it, you make a debt you'll pay later, and later is when you least want creditors. Great pep talk, Naruto said, breath easy, heat moving like a cat stretching under his sternum. Next you'll tell me about hydration. Drink water, Karen said without mercy. He laughed and misstepped and the lane dropped him 3 feet. Fu was there with a delighted, ha, and a hand at his back, not catching him so much as tipping him back into his own balance. You're fun to bully, she announced. I mean teach, ha. He found the ground laughing and came up steadier. Temari's mouth threatened a smile and thought better. Hinata's fingers flexed at her side and relaxed. The heat under his ribs made a pleased noise that wasn't a noise. Zoon's whistle cut clean through everything. She didn't visit training fields to be popular. She visited to be obeyed. Cat and two Anbu shadows slid out of the tree line behind her like guilt. Shizun held a folder only dead things should be comfortable in. Up, she said, and the word the field learned was now. They crowded the map in the war room half an hour later with salt still drying in our hair and the smell of grass on their knees. Tsunade didn't bother with preambles. She stabbed a line the color of a bruise across the sky over fire country. Little annotated circles rode that line like beads on a string. Null choir net, she said. 31 sky buoys. Linked tones. They drifted from the western shelf while you were making the air your pet. If it locks over Konoha, 90% of jutsu gets ugly. The other 10 goes sideways, and our med tents write poems about stamina loss. Karen's hand had already moved over the circles, measuring. Nodes, she asked. 7 primaries, Kat said. Hit 3 and the rest start arguing with each other. Arguing is good, Tamari said. Arguing is music. Arguing gives us gaps, Tsunade corrected. Fu and Tamari, you'll shear the buoys from their anchors. Hinata, Karen, ride the idiots. She pointed at Naruto with affectionate contempt. Wing step arcs and plant counter sigils on the primaries. Naruto, you keep the sky honest and your heat quieter than your mouth. Naruto saluted with 2 fingers because 1 would be disrespectful and 3 a lie. Yes, ma'am. Tsunade didn't smile. He'll be there, she said, meaning Tenroku the way you mean a weather system. If you can't win, you learn without dying. If you can win, you don't brag. And if the choice is between saving the village and finishing a personal fight. Save the village, Naruto said softly. Before she could make the question heavy. Good, Tsunade said, because I don't have time to bury you with a speech. They launched at gold hour when roofs were coins and the river wore a sash of light. Tamari carved lanes from the west wind like she was buttering bread. Fu rode those lanes with insect bright joy, hopping above cloud and diving through it like scandal. Hinata stood at Naruto's shoulder with a harness of paper tags and a coil of counter-sigil wire that looked like it wanted a better life. Karen wore a harness too, but hers had knives tucked in. Where medics weren't supposed to have them. The first buoy saw them and pretended not to. The sphere hung on 310 thin cables, tone dishes swiveling, finding angles. Tamari lifted a narrow gust under the outer dish and set it singing 2 cents sharp. The buoy winced. Fu whooped, pinwheeled, and kicked the anchor line with the underside of her foot. The line twanged like a sulky harp. Left, Hinata called. 2 degrees, no, 3. The dish will compensate there. Naruto felt the correction in his ankles. He stepped into it, wing step catching the lane like a thrown rope. Heat rose polite under his skin. He didn't flare. He set it like a table. The band hummed. He tossed a clone into empty air and felt it flare to ash against a cross tone. Good, a map. The ash drifted, and the ashes dry. Fort told him where the wind wanted him pour. Karen planted the first counter-sigil with 3 clean taps and an insult under her breath in a language seals understand better than flattery. The sigil lay down and did not shine. Good sigils don't boast. The buoy hiccuped. The dish cocked its head, offended. Tamari shoved. Fu yanked. The anchor snapped with a sound like a promise kept too late. Next, Tamari said. They learned the pattern by the 4th buoy and unlearned it by the 5th because the net adapted. The tones started coming in braids, not single lines. The dishes drifted into a stag. That made their harmonics immune to simple teasing. Naruto felt his feathered vectors itch and bring his elbows close, shaping force like trying to redirect rain. Root me, he told Hinata. She didn't nod. She breathed a new count. And the band took the cue. Naruto opened his mouth and let Doncall out without making it a soliloquy. The note found Tamari's lanes as if the air had been waiting tea. Obi asked to sing lead in the chorus it pretends it's above. Fu howled harmony, bad and perfect, and the dishes flashed like angry birds. Karen leaned into the wind and slapped counter sigils in place, while Naruto's note bent the incoming tone into being someone else's problem. Hinata's breath kept him from making the sound an argument. Choir over solo. He'd learned. 3 primaries down and the nay. Tea looked less like a doctrine and more like a sweater with threads asking to be pulled. Then the sky changed its mind about being something they could bully. It started as a vertical step in pressure, a staircase turned on its tail. The air thinned the way rooms do when an important person arrives and you don't like that they're important. Naruto felt the shift in his teeth first, then his shoulders. The lane under his feet misremembered itself. He rode the misremembering as far as it would take him and then let go clean. Tenroku didn't announce himself with thunder. Thunder announced him, after. Like applause for a man who doesn't care for clapping. He slid out of a seam in the clouds with no hurry. Hands open. No visible weapons. The storm focus around his throat looked like an accident with lightning and good taste. He glanced once at Naruto and then at the lattice of buoys and dishes as if rearranging a chessboard with his eyes. "Stop breaking my lesson," he told Naruto pleasantly. "Your lesson is rude," Naruto said. "It is efficient," Tenroku said. He lifted one hand and the whole string of buoys on the western arc moved a foot east as if the sky were a neat clerk and he had a form with a stamp. Tamari swore like a sandstorm under her breath. "He's slaving the anchors to his pressure map," she snapped. "I need a static to push against and he eats static for breakfast." "Then we give him moving," Hinata said. "Quick, calm, Naruto, roots, Tamari, cross, Fu, now." Fu didn't ask what now meant. She dove and then jerked her wings to a stall that turned her into a falling nail. She hit the anchor on buoy 7 with a shoulder and laughter. It snapped and spun. Tenroku looked pleased, which is how you know you should be afraid. Naruto met him halfway up where the air made knives out of nothing. "You propping these zealots," he called. Riding a narrow lane, Tamari ghosted up to him with a twist of the fan that would look effortless to people who didn't fight wind for a living. Tenroku didn't glance down. "They are very good at building cages," he said. "It is kind to put your children in cages at the roadside until the war ends. The alternative is letting the sky choose who it eats." Naruto angled a feathered vector and the talon that wasn't there sliced past the angle with the honesty of tools. "A cage is a storm with a lock," he said. "You just like bigger locks." Tenroku laughed without contempt. "You'll make a good captain if you don't die," he said. "Show me your lanes." Naruto did what a younger him would have called stupid and this new him called honest. He shared. His doncall threaded through the calm's charm to Tamari, Hinata, Karen, Fu, and the Anbu pairs darting under the net with kites of their own. Not loud. A line. A spine. Temari's fan lashed a crosswind against Naruto's tone. And the intersection made a ridge in the air, 1 step high, 2 body lengths wide, where nothing had existed a breath ago. "Run," she ordered. He ran. The band hummed like a hand on a small of a back. He hit buoy 9 on the split step and lay a counter sigil with Karen's speed, a move his body would memorize tomorrow and call experience. Hinata's breath carried, his exhale into the seal to set its timing to the net's pulse. The buoy staggered like a drunk given better shoes. The net's tone wobbled. Not a failure, a question. Tenroku smiled into the question as if it were his. "Better," he said, and went finally to work. He didn't sprint. He didn't need to. He shifted pressure field by field without lifting a hand, the way men of his kind change a room by deciding to enter it. Lanes Naruto trusted skittered into new places. Dishes that had been depressed became eager. Thunder Aegis bled into the corners, a skin of charge that made plumage guard feel prudish. Naruto tried for something like an uppercut on the sky, using wing step and momentum and a disrespectful grin he wore when he was tired of losing. Tenroku cut him off with a vacuum seam, thin as a string pulled across a throat. Feathered vectors sang as they deflected the seam and Naruto's shoulder survived out of sheer spite. He turned the force aside and shoved the deflection into a dead pocket Karen had marked earlier. The pocket grew. 1 dish choked. Fu slammed into Naruto's slipstream like a joyous mistake and borrowed his doncall, humming it back with bug-bright harmonics. The note got ugly and better at once. 3 Anbu kites shot through, laying weights on lines Tamari leaned against to make the net arc toward its own anchors. "Primary east," Hinata said, steady even while. Gravity sent the wind a memo about consequences. 3 more beats. Karen's hand found Naruto's wrist on a pass. She slapped a small amp tag onto the band, not to change it, to remind it. "Don't hoard it," she said. A shove that sounded like care. "Root." He did. He sent the hum that lived under his sternum into the other throats on the line. Not all of it. Enough. Doncall thickened into a braid. Temeri's gust stopped being solo and started being sectionals. Low wind, high wind, downstroke, upstroke, big band air. The net began to argue with itself. Buoys out of tune bullied the tuned into new keys. Dishes hunted for static and found lanes instead, nothing to plant on. Karen's counter sigils refused to be beautiful and stayed useful, dragging primaries off their timing by half-breaths and ugly luck. Tenroku tilted his head with professional appreciation and finally cut the joke. He let the Thunder Aegis show. Not a layer, a habit soaked into him, the way Naruto's heat sat in his bones. Charge drew up his forearms like tattoos that had never been inked because lightning refuses to be permanent. The air around him thinned further until each inhale in Naruto's body had to decide to be labor. You build choirs, Tenroku said, less amused now. Good, now look. He lifted both hands like a conductor and the buoys straightened in the air as if on parade. The net's lines equalized in a breath. Something their math had not allowed for. Something only a man with his hands in the weather could make indecent. Naruto felt every counter sigil complain. Temari swore, this time loud. Push, Hinata said. Not a plea, a plan. Naruto didn't take a bigger breath. He took a better one. Doncall left his mouth cleaner than it had ever been, an edge instead of a blaze. Temari flexed when rough it not to thicken it but to comb it. Fu matched the beat instead of the pitch and finally started singing in the way she flew. Karen's hand traced a seam in the air and tugged it a fraction like a seamstress chosen to fix a wedding dress in a hallway. The net tripped. Not much. Enough. Hinata's seal landed on the last primary like a fingertip pressing a pulse. The line ran through the buoy array. Not collapse. Stall. For 7 heartbeats, the sky above Konoha forgot what it had been told to do. Now, Temari said, they tore 3 anchors, then 2 more out of order, which is the only order that ever matters in a fight. The net buckled into a trapezoid that would insult a geometer. Civilians below didn't see the lattice. They felt their lungs decide to be efficient again. In the hospital, 3 patients no one had mentioned today stopped being tired for no reason. Tsunade put her hands on the map table and let herself stand lighter. Tenroku's face didn't fall. It never would. He ate his jaw in the way of men adding new weights to a bar and then did what bullies with vision and kindness logic always do when generosity fails. He escalated. He inhaled like drinking. Clouds above them flattened into an enormous lens. A storm disk big enough that all the village could have set plates on it. The light went wrong at the edges. Naruto felt an itch at the base of his skull where you know the sky is about to stop being weather and start being policy. The apex, Karen said, horror so clinical it ticked boxes. He's starting it from here. What's that? Fu asked. Alert now, gleeful gone. Stormfront that never breaks. Temari said. He owns up. We get under. Naruto looked at the disk and understood the shape if not the math. Aerolith would live in that disk like a god's ring. The Pale Ministry would call it safety. The country would call it weather. The kids would call it dark at noon. No, he said, not to Tenroku and not to Tsunade and not to the sky. He said it to his own heat because if he let it would rise like rage and burn useful into spectacle. Root me, Hinata breathed. It wasn't for him alone. It was to all of them. He made a spine of Doncall and did not climb it alone. Temari braided pressure into it, not higher, longer. Fu kicked holes in the disk's newborn skin on the beat, laughing again because fear had to go somewhere. Karen's sigils clung to the primaries like burrs. Anbu kites toggled their own tiny anthems and made the net's argument messy. Tenroku glided a hand and closed a hole Fu left without needing to look. Come up, he told Naruto one more time. Almost gentle. We finish it there. Finish this first, Naruto said, and put all his listening into the sky. The feathered vectors along his arms were not just shields, they were needles. He threaded the air, not metaphor. He found where slipstreams parted to make the disk slick and he sewed them wrong with sun thread. Narrow heat running along arcs Hinata counted out of thin air. The stitches held for half a breath, then 2. Temari's winds found the seams and pulled. The disk puckered. The apex stalled. Tenroku's eyes narrowed. Not angry, focused in the way people get when they stop to sharpen a blade because dullness is rude. He dropped out of position and came at Naruto direct, not a cut of pressure, a shoulder and a talon, and the unglamorous art of making one body precisely superior to another. Naruto met him because the part of him that thought roads was useless in this inch. Feathered vectors caught the talon and angled it aside. His left foot missed the lane because Tenroku had the weather and the right to be smug about it. Naruto didn't panic. He took a hit to the ribs that would bruise tomorrow into a long day. He kept his mouth open just enough to keep Donkal from dying into spit. Share, Karen hissed in his ear from nowhere. More. He did. He let more of the hum inside him go out of him than he'd planned. It ran down the line into Hinata first, because she was closest. And then into Temari because she had made the path, and Fu because Fu takes everything offered, and then into little charms on Anbu wrists, and this he did not into a half-dozen prayer wheels turning in houses where grandmothers were making soup. The choir wasn't pretty. It held. The net collapsed like a tent politely giving up at the end of a market day after being asked to work overtime. Buoys went dull along the ridge. Dishes hung their heads. The tone lifted out of the city like a brood of gnats losing interest. A dozen little aches stopped aching. Shizune looked up from a chart and rolled her shoulders and didn't know why. Tenroku didn't curse. He just pivoted to the next fight. His hand cut and Aerolith answered. It came out of cloud as if epping from behind a curtain that had been there for years waiting for applause. A rock the size of a district, pierced by a meteor spine that glowed dull as an ember that forgot it was meant to go out. Iron vein fins along the edges angled, catching jet streams like sails. The whole mass hummed at a low, hunger-patient note Naruto felt in his legs. Wow, Fu said, delighted and appalled. He lives in a boulder. He lives in a decision. Temari muttered. Naruto wasn't done. He'd started this day telling the sky no, he wasn't going to end it curtsying to architecture. We go, he said, simple. Because he was learning when to stop performing leadership and just led. They went in unglamorous. Under a lip where the vein fins made a waste channel for lightning spill, Temari flattening wind like a scrape along a wall. Fu slaloming with her shoulders because she didn't have to be pretty to be precise. Hinata's hand finding Naruto's back and pressing once in a count he would find later in his dreams and not be embarrassed by. Karen slapping a grounding tag on his shoulder that made shocks tame and him grumble. Inside was not halls and not caves. It was ribs of iron around a spine from the sky, chambers tuned for pressure, tone. Charge. Null hymns threaded through the supports like scaffolding built of scolding. Ministry tech had been bolted onto old stone like a child's lock on a myth. They moved fast because walking slow here invited the room to make you into another instrument. Hinata's Byakugan found junctions where three tones met and shook hands. Karen tapped those junctions with counter sigils so the handshakes went wrong at parties. Temari used micro-gusts to keep dust drifting and sound visible. Fu made a face at a room that wanted to still her wings and buzzed anyway until it learned manners. Tenroku met them at the spine chamber, because of course he did. It was open to sky along a slit that would slice a cloud and call it laziness. The meteor rod rose through the room, humming with earth memory and sky greed. Tenroku leaned one shoulder to it the way some men lean to banisters when they're waiting to teach you something you asked for. Good, he said, to Nar, Yuto and the choir behind him and the people he believed he was saving. Let's make a rule. He didn't wait for consent. He brought the thunder aegis down and everything brightened for an instant like a flash at a wedding nobody wanted to remember later. Pressure cuts crossed the floor and made ridges in the air. Naruto stepped into them because you cannot learn a map by wishing it had fewer rivers. They fought without drama for 3 minutes that cut a year off everybody's life but wrote it back in technique. Naruto used feathered vectors until they weren't new anymore. He stitched slipstreams, shut with sun thread and then snipped his own work to throw Tenroku off a stride. Tenroku showed economy the way carpenters show joints, no waste. He didn't punish. He demonstrated and expected catching up. Karen swore once when a null seam grazed her shoulder and Hinata answered with a pulse of gentle chakra that got past the denial tech because kindness is not a technique any bell understands how to erase. Fu body checked a siphon pipe with glee and didn't complain when it made her hair stand up for a minute. Tamari put the fan on her shoulder and threw wind with her off hand to prove a point. NT about training she didn't feel like saying out loud. Enough, Tenroku said eventually, evenly. He tapped the spine with 2 fingers. The apex thrummed through Naruto's bones. You learn. Good. Now survive this. The disc above them thickened as if he'd poured syrup into the sky. The apex stopped being a start and became a state. Wind lanes below 10,000 feet began to pack themselves into tunnels with locks. Aerolith rose. A big and different. The world under it went dim. Village, Hinata said, and Naruto's mouth had already shaped the same word. He didn't plan a speech. He did the thing. They'd been practicing and the thing he would have done anyway without practice. Root. Not command. Hand off. His doncall ran down the wire to Tamari, where it got wind scored and useful, to Fu, W. Here it learned a happy stutter that made Wait think twice, to Karen, whose sigils closed around it, not to Cage, to Aim, to Hinata, whose breath stabilized it without owning it. It went to Cat and T. He Anbu pairs and then, through the city like a rumor you want to be true, into the people who had prayer wheels and market songs and cooking to finish and hands that know rhythm even when nobody pays them to. The choir hit the net remnants and the apex the way heavy rain hits dust roads. It didn't win. It changed the surface. The apex didn't collapse. It hesitated, which in the life of a storm is everything. Naruto used the hesitation like a wedge. He threw himself into one of the tunnels and sewed its lock wrong, not a knot, a tangle a clever man hates because you can't show your students what to avoid. Tenroku slashed the tangle apart and Naruto laughed because he had made a man like that waste 2 seconds. He did it again somewhere worse. Fu took the hesitation and made holes you could run 2 shoulders through. Tamari took it and made ramps where there had been walls. Hinata took it and put a hand flat between Naruto's shoulder blades when his heat tried to turn into rage. He didn't push, he kept. Karen took it and crowbarred the remaining primaries off their timelines with seals that will give her a reputation in 3 countries. Konoha took it and breathed. Tenroku looked down at the village and for the first time in any room he had been in today, had to consider something he didn't plan. He chose fast. Of course he did. He lifted his face to the apex and spoke not to the people or to Naruto, but to weather. Stay. The disc held, heavy as a hand. The apex would not go away because one small town had a choir. But it would not fall and lock today. He wasn't surrendering. He was rescheduling. I will take it back, he said, in case anyone in the room thought mercy had converted him. You have until the rains. You already gave me that deadline, Naruto said, chest on fire in the right way. I wrote it down. Tenroku's mouth tilted into an acknowledgement you don't give to children. Then don't be late, he said, and gestured. Aerolith slid sideways into cloud like a door closing. The disc thinned from policy back to weather. The net that was supposed to be a curfew for a village finished dying without drama. Naruto's knees decided to become knees again. He streaked, oohed in the spine chamber with hands that wanted to shake and didn't because Hinata was breathing and he matched her and the band hummed and the habit of not dying insisted on continuity. They didn't whoop. Tamari flicked the fan and made a last, petty gust at the room. Fu did a small victory roll upside down and bumped elbows with Karen on the way past, earning a scowl and a secret smile. Kat said, clear, in a voice that had been waiting all morning to spend that word. Naruto touched the spine with 2 fingers and whispered a thank you to a rock, which is the sort of behavior you pick up around priestesses and glass domes. Outside, Konoha looked like itself again. Laundry bold, arguments productive, rooftops honest. The buoy husks lay in fields and on roofs like ugly lanterns after a festi. Val where you learn more about your neighbors than you wanted. Shizune walked between them doling out instructions in a tone that made grown Chunin say, yes, without sarcasm. Tsunade stood at the toe-ar window and allowed herself one long breath that said nothing out loud. They took the last hour slow on purpose. Karen flagged the worst of the null bite symptoms at triage tents with chalk notes on forearms. Tamari taught 2 genin to tilt a dish so it drains rain instead of gathering it. Fu stole an apple and handed half to the kid who almost caught her doing it. Hinata checked in with a dozen people who kept pretending they didn't need checking. She did the touches you don't notice until you do. Naruto stood on a roof because standing on roofs is how you measure whether a day thinks it beat you. The sun came back out like it had a grudge. The band on his wrist warmed and then went neutral, job done. Seimei stood in his mind like a bell hung in a room, refusing to be caged in praise or hate. Tenroku hovered at the edge of the sky like a dead and a dare. Hinata joined him without steps. He didn't hear them over the day. She didn't say good job because compliments are how you deflate necessary ambition. She touched the back of his hand with her fingers and drew back without dramatics. You didn't overdraw, she noted, and he liked that this was the metric. Wanted to, he admitted. I know, she said. Wanting isn't failing. He looked at her mouth because looking at eyes is a lot when you're not ready to say a thing. We have to climb, he said. Not just fly. Then we climb, she said. We have lanes now. We make more. Tamari called up from the street like a friend pretending to be irritated. Team meeting, she said. I'm naming a thing. Don't make me come up there and draft you into your own project. What thing? Naruto asked. Tamari didn't look up. She didn't need to. Resonance core, she said. Karen's idea. She'll take credit and then pretend to hate it. Karen, already at the corner, scowled over the tops of her glasses. I do hate it, she said. But I like running it. Fu hung from a laundry line because of course she did. Do I get a jacket? Absolutely not, Karen said. Maybe a pin. Tamari allowed. If you stop asking. Fu shrugged. I'll steal one. Hinata's hand caught Naruto's sleeve at the seam, a light, habitual claim. We're going up there, she said, looking toward nothing that any of them could see yet. Aerolith and the apex and the man who thinks kindness is a storm. Soon, he said. Before the rains, she said. He nodded "'Cause that was a contract and better than a vow." They walked into Tsunade's office smelling like ozone and victory they refused to brag about. Tsunade poured tea with the gravitas of a woman who would rather pour whiskey and held it out to each of them with a hand that shook less than it had a year ago. Save your hero speeches, she said. Spend them when you have to explain yourself to children. Naruto took the tea because disrespecting hospitality brings curses you can't sew shut. He's going to turn the whole sky into a hallway with locks, he said. We can open some. We can't open all. Open enough, Tsunade said. People will climb the rest. Kat set a folder on the desk so quiet it screamed. Seimei sent a message, she said, with the reluctance of someone delivering mail from AM. And who might be a future ally or a very articulate future problem. Tsunade lifted the paper with 2 fingers. The handwriting was precise as a fault line. She read, then looked at Naruto with that particular affection she saves for the brats who insist on turning into leaders when it would be so much easier if they didn't. He will toll the monastery bells when the apex tries to fix itself over his people, she said. He will do it whether we approve or not. He invites us to not be stupid while he does. Temari's eyebrows went up. A good invitation, she said. An honest one, Karen added. Fu swung both legs at once from the windowsill she wasn't supposed to be sitting on. We'll make a storm sing, she said, dreamy and feral. Naruto watched steam curl up from the tea and disappear into the room like breath on a cold day. He thought of a glass dome that listened when people breathed together, of a foundry that made fences out of sound, of a boy under a ceiling and a woman with hands tea. Hat knew where ribs are thick and where they aren't, of a hawk who argued whether like morality and smiled like consequences were a kindness. He didn't plan his next speech. He planned his next step. Training at dawn, he said. We build lanes you can't see from the ground. We make Dancall clearer and smaller and meaner. We test rebirth in a bucket, not a river. Karen mumbled something obscene about buckets and consent. Tamari clapped his shoulder with the fan. Fu saluted with 2 fingers and stole a biscuit from Tsunade's desk with the elan of a dead girl who had gotten very good at not dying. Hinata wrote 3 notes in a small, neat hand and tucked them where they would be remembered. That night, the sky over Konoha behaved. It didn't storm or posture. It wore stars like apologies. Naruto slept in a real bed and dreamed of seams he could stitch and seams he shouldn't, and woke with the quiet, ordinary certainty that he was going to have to die small and learn 5 times before he beat a man who turned air into law. The dream didn't scare him. It made him hungry. Dawn made the training field into dew and breath. They didn't discuss destiny. They stretched. They listened. They counted. Tamari drew new lanes. Mean little ones with personalities. Fu hit them wrong on purpose to learn their jokes. Karen set a metronome on a stump and glared at it until it admitted it had been rushing the entire time. Hinata breathed with Naruto until the band hummed in a register he would recognize later when someone died, and he made the note without ritual. Far away, beyond what maps call polite, Aerolith cast a moving shadow over rivers that didn't know they were in politics, and a man with talons practiced restraint because he wanted to win clean. In a high monastery, a bell rang not to command, but to warn a town to hold soup bowls steady until the storm decided to pass or be persuaded differently. Naruto locked his ankles on a lane Temari made just for him and didn't step off early this time. He ran it to the edge and let go when the lane ended, because letting go is what you do when you trust you've made enough roads to find another one. Again, Temari said. He laughed and did it again. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. Fivefold Rebirth. The Borderlands didn't have a word for sky big enough to hold the thing hanging over them. At noon the light went to ash. The wind lay down on its side and pretended to be calm. Farmers stood in furrows and forgot the names of their tools for a breath because the horizon had been replaced by a disk, black at the middle, bruised at the rim. That moved as if the planet had grown a second lid and was trying it on. Apex, Karen said, and didn't waste any extra syllables on dread. Temari climbed the low watchtower and tasted the air with her teeth. He changed the locks. On the road below, refugees made a line that tried to look like it wasn't afraid. A bell tower, one not owned by any monastery, just an agreed-upon place for noise, stood at the edge of the fields. Kat set her hand to the rope and didn't pull. She was waiting for the call. Naruto closed his eyes and didn't think about fear on purpose. Hinata's breath found him, easy and steady, and his heat rose to meet it like a bird stretching under a hand that never forced, only invited. The band at his wrist warmed. The feathered vectors along his forearms turned their edges toward the sky. Fu hovered at shoulder height because she never had the patience to stand and the discipline to pretend. If it gets any darker, I'm going to punch a cloud, she announced. Use your words, Karen said dryly. But her fingers were already sliding tags into the loops on her harness. Then punch a cloud. Tsunade's orders had been simple and indecently difficult. Coalition. Leaf. Sand. Taki. Priestesses. Defected ministry cadres were not calling them defected in public. Split 3 ways. Ground anchors, bell towers, sky seams. Naruto didn't command. He routed. The new resonance core, Karen's name, Temari's structure, Hinata's rhythm, had turned choir into logistics. A ripple moved through the wheat like a breath under a blanket. Not wind. The apex was settling. Now, Kat said, and tolls climbed the fields like someone telling the world to get up. Not panic bells. Counter hymn pattern. Naruto felt it in his ribs before his ears. Seime's hand in the strike, exacting and human. Bellman changed sides, Fu sang. Cheerful and unhelpful. No, Hinata breathed. He kept the village. Temari pointed with the fan. 3 sky buoys hidden under the disk's shadow rim. Karen, you anchor Naruto. Fu, harass their dish angles. Hinata, on him, Hinata said. Naruto didn't wait for the hero close-up. He kicked off a low wall and wing-stepped onto the first invisible lane Temari pulled taut. The lane bucked once under the weight of the disk's pressure. He softened his ankles, stepped again, and let the lane tell his feet where to be. A buoy slid out of the darkness like an insult. He caught the rim, hissed when static bit, and slapped a counter sigil into a seam that Karen pointed without looking. Left. 2 fingers down. Trust me. The sigil settled. The buoy tried to tune itself and got bored of its own tone. Good, Temari said. Next. The apex thickened for the length of one inhale. The fields went blue at the edges. Naruto tasted iron. Seams, Hinata whispered. He didn't try to see them. He felt where the air slipped around the disk's belly and left stitches loose. Sun thread hummed in his bones, not hot, tight. He reached and sewed a seam wrong on purpose. The sky flinched. Lightning crawled the underside of the disk like a cat deciding whether to leap. Tenroku came out of that crawl. He didn't arrive like a strike. He arrived like a solution that had been waiting for a problem. Cloak torn down to utility, forearms scored with thunder aegis that didn't look like armor so much as a habit, he floated 5 body lengths above the bell tower and studied. The mess with the satisfaction of a man whose plan had started behaving. Naruto, he said, because that was the kind of fight this was. Names first, weapons next. Tenroku, Naruto said, and felt his own voice land in the air without echo. He didn't cough to cover nerves. He had run out of the version of himself that needed to. You took my net, Tenroku said, conversational. You taught a town to sing. Pretty. Inefficient. We like inefficient, Naruto said. It keeps people in the equation. Tenroku flicked 2 fingers, and 3 buoys stopped pretending to be separate and became a small constellation. The tone they made wasn't a note so much as a decision. All the lanes Naruto trusted detuned a fraction. Temari swore in sand under her breath. Fu kicked a dish hard enough to make it consider a new career. Karen said, now, to nobody, and slapped a small, ugly amp tag onto Naruto's band as he passed low enough for her to reach. The tag bit. The band warmed. Naruto felt his Donkal Iden from a broad road into something like twine. Share, Hinata said. He didn't make a speech about it. He let the twine out of him and into them. Hinata first, because she was already there. Temari, who braided wine through it like a loon that had been lonely. Fu, who bounced it along her wings with delighted imprecision that somehow became exactly what was needed. Karen, who didn't sing at all. And still made the line stronger just by giving it places to tie. The bell tower across the field, the one Seimei had marked with a white flag dusty from honest weather, told once in a counter hymn. Frequency that made the apex forget for a breath that it had an agenda. Risers, Cat yelled. 4 ministry squads burst from a hedgerow with shock cages on poles, trying to cap the tower's mouth. The IR masks were the same tidy blankness Naruto hated. The first squad ran into a Temari crosswind and fell into each other like laundry. The second reached the steps and met Hinata's palm. Soft, necessary, inarguable. She touched 2 wrists and a shoulder and the cage fell without drama. The third took one look at Fu and decided to engage nobody, because fear is a talent too. The fourth went for civilians. Naruto moved before thought had a committee. He wing-stepped sideways into a lane that didn't exist until he insisted and angled his feathered vectors to redirect a thrown cage into a trough. He cage crackled and died with a smell like rain on tile. He didn't wait to feel good about it. His heat wanted to lift. He told it not to. He let plumage guards sit close. Don't climb alone, Hinata breathed. He didn't. Tenroku watched all of it and smiled the way teachers smile when they have to start using newer chalk. He lifted one hand and the apex's center went blacker. The rim turned the lore of a bruise you'd lay ice on out of habit. The pressure doubled, then didn't. His economy was arithmetic, not theater. You could feel exactly where he put what. Rock, Fu muttered, low. He's putting on his big bird. Tenroku did not grow feathers. The air did. Talon shadows flickered along his arms where charge collected. When he cut, the cut came first, then the hiss of air figuring it out. Keep him honest, Temari said. And meant Naruto. He met Tenroku at the height the bell rope reached. Not noble, practical. Feathered vectors caught the first pressure cut and threw it sideways into an irrigation ditch where it ripped water into teachable waves. Naruto answered with a Donkal not to disrupt, to point, a pitch that said pull there. Temari did. Karen's tag clicked on his wrist like a metronome learning patience. Tenroku flicked his eyes at Naruto's elbow, saw the angle before Naruto made it, and shaped the air to make that angle wrong. Naruto let the angle go without grief and say, wet a seam in the slipstream near Tenroku's knee, the seam snagged his drift. Tenroku landed half a foot low, which for him was failure and for anybody else would have been ballet. Better, Tenroku said, and hit him in the chest not with talon or fist, but with a decision. The world narrowed. The apex pressed the lane under Naruto's feet into something like glass. His plumage guard buckled, his heat spilled. He died. Not for long. Not in any way that counts in a ledger the world recognizes. He lost the moment. The muscle memory that knits breath to intent snapped. A flat cold went through him. No time passed and all of it did. He hit the ground on one knee that wasn't there. He rebirth. It was not grand. It was ugly and small and brilliant like a spark inside dirty tinder. Pulse 1. His hearing returned before color. He heard Hinata's count and matched it with a sound that didn't leave his throat. He did not jump up. He listened. Tenroku's pressure cadence ran through the wheat like an argument. The disc hummed on an F he'd learned to hate. Seime's tower answered with a minor third, stubborn. Up, Tamari said, mild and command. He stood. Tenroku slashed and he redirected. Pulse. 2. Angling feathered vectors to turn force without pride. The cut didn't hit him. It hit a stone marker with a family name on it tossed into the field as a boundary and shaved the letters clean. Nar. Yuto flinched the way a boy flinches when the world touches a quiet thing. He turned the flinch into aim. He bound. Pulse 3, throwing sun thread across a seam at Tenroku's back hip. The thread tugged. Tenroku stepped into it and turned the pull into a pivot because he was a jerk and a genius. Naruto overreached. Habit. And the apex slapped him down with the mildness of a parent who doesn't want to be angry. He tasted copper and faraway thunder. He slid in dry wheat and got a mouthful of old straw. He wanted to laugh and couldn't. Share, Karen hissed. He did. Pulse 4, not noble, mechanical. He let Donkal root deep. Past the skin fuss, into every charm and throat on the line. It went ragged in places and still carried. Cat's team on the east set their own rhythm and his note threaded it instead of pushing. Tamari caught the line and combed it. Fu braided Joy into it until Joy became a tactic. Hinata steadied the downbeat, the place where breath becomes decision. The bell tower tolled again, Seime counting, exact, uncompromising, and the field lifted their heads, even those who had never been taught to sing anything but work songs, and hump. The apex hesitated. Not much. Enough. Naruto felt the fifth thing like a door behind his sternum that had never opened because he never asked politely. He didn't rip it. He set his palm flat on the band and held very still the way you do. Oh, when a bird is deciding whether your hand is a branch. Plumage guard softened, lost the hard angle and bloomed, colorless, more sensation than light, wider than one body. It unfurled over the bell tower and the first 3 rows of refugees. Washed across Hinata's shoulders and Temari's cheek and Karen's scowl, slid along Fu's wings and made the bruised place on her scapula pause in its complaint. Aurora wing. Not a shield. A wash. Naruto didn't like the word healing because it gets used like an apology. This wasn't that. It was clearance. It cleaned the drip of null tone out of coils and joints. Made ankles remember they weren't obliged to flinch. While it held, bells muted without being shattered. Karen's seals went down without being offended. Hinata's breath went through him and out as if he had never learned to get in his own way. Tenroku's eyes narrowed in something like admiration he would never say aloud. There you are, he murmured, and escalated again. He walked up into the disc until the black center took his outline and gave it back wearing a corona. Not light, less than light. The air around him failed to exist the way shade fails to be warm. Black sun rock, the shape of a storm that eats color and only gives thunder. He fell. It wasn't a dive, it was a verdict. Naruto stepped in and bound the seam left of that verdict with sun thread and snipped it himself. The fall stuttered. Tamari threw a crosswind chisel to bite the edge. Fu slammed Joy into Tenroku's shoulder like a chain of fireworks. The bell tower tolled. Seime's strike was human and unshowy and saved children from a pressure wave that would have made them forget their names for a day. Tenroku burned the last 10 feet like a swear. The shock rolled the wheat flat in a circle and jammed against the aurora wing like rain hitting a eave. It split. Half went up. Half went into ground that had been taught by grandmothers to hold. The first of the anchor pylons, Iron Teeth the ministry had sunk INTO the fields months ago, lit with a nasty glow and started singing the way metal sings when it wants you to bruise yourself. Karen was already there with a med bag that had nothing medical in it and a face that guaranteed someone would be screamed at later. She slapped 2 counter sigils that didn't match and forced them to become friends. The pylon went quiet. A squad of ministry men took that moment to remember they were mortals. Dropped their poles, and ran. Cat let them, because she had other jobs. Left bank. Hinata called, and Naruto was already there because he had started building that habit yesterday. Tenroku met him with an elbow that would have been mercy if it had landed on a different boy. Naruto tucked his ribs, angled, let it slide down feathered vectors and off into the ground. The earth coughed. Economy. Tenroku said, in praise or lecture. I'm learning, Naruto said. You are dying better, Tenroku corrected, and took his air again. The sixth time Naruto's world went thin, he almost overdrew. He felt the rebirth like a breath caught in a chest that refuses to admit fear, and he almost pulled hard enough to burn. Hinata's hand found the seam of his sleeve as if she had been waiting at that exact second for that exact sin. No, she said, gentle, and he didn't. He died small again instead. Pulse 1. Listen, Tenroku's weight in the wind wasn't random, he optimized where even kindness counts calories. Naruto caught the cadence and put it in his ankle. Pulse 2. Redirect. He made himself an angle and not a wall. Pulse 3. Bind. Not to stop. To tug at timings that thought they were laws. Pulse 4. Share. He didn't sing louder. He made more throats able to carry the line. The fifth wasn't about him. He turned the Aurora wing out again, lighter, narrower. Choosing not to throw it like a blanket but to lay it like a hand on someone's brow. The bell tower's wood groaned like an old man made to stand in a storm, then steadied. Hinata's breath didn't falter when a cross tone tried to make her lungs shy. Fu took a deep inhale that made her look briefly surprised, then she laughed in Tenroku's face, wild and delighted. Temari's fan edge chipped and her wrist did not. On the ridge across the river, 5 bell towers, not Seime's, rang a ministry pattern that told civilians to line up for blessing and caging both. A squad of white masked men raised a null web that would have put a lid on a town too small to have a name on any decent map. Seimei walked into that web with the bell staff across his shoulders like a yoke and didn't look to Naruto for permission. He planted his staff and let his counter him toll. This was no secret weapon. It was the old work of a man who had spent his life making sound behave and was done being the only one at the altar. The web shook. It didn't fall. It looked. It heard the choir caught in the fields. It listened to itself and found it wasn't alone. Seimei struck again. Human timing, human error, human courage, and the web released. Not because it had been forced but because someone showed it another way for one long, stubborn note. Tenroku saw it. He owed Seimei something older than ideology and repaid it by deciding not to kill him today. He pivoted back to Naruto, all business. End it, he said. Not cruel, efficient. Okay, Naruto said, because sometimes agreeing is the meaner choice. They climbed together. Naruto not alone. Never alone. Temari's lanes braided under him. Hinata's count in the marrow. Fu's laughter like climbing holds hammered into rock. Karen's metronome tick-tick somewhere he couldn't see. Tenroku dragged the apex's black center down to the height of last week's rain. The world went gray and close. You could see your own breath in a way a person shouldn't at noon. Naruto ran out of room to be clever. He stepped into the fall. Wing step became not a trick but a commitment to be at the next place fully. He put his shoulder under Tenroku's verdict and used feathered vectors not to protect. To aim the impact. Up and away from the bell tower, into the wide mouth of the field. Earth complained and held. The talons finally found him. They raked across the Aurora wing end. Plumage guard together and left a heat gouge that would be a bruise under a bruise. He didn't try to be brave. He swore like a person. Tenroku grinned because honesty is the one thing that always gets extra marks. Naruto reached for the sun thread a final time, and this time he didn't sew the slipstream, he stitched himself. He tied heat into bone in 3 places, shoulder, wrist, just below the brie. Asked bone where the band rested, and made his breath and the dawn-call the same object. The apex felt him. It pushed down. He pushed with, not against. He didn't refuse the storm. He made his choir walk rough it shoulder to shoulder until the storm had to open a corridor out of embarrassment. Tenroku's eyes widened the smallest possible amount, which is to say, the way a man does when his vocabulary acquires a verb he had been pretending didn't exist. He chose a different tactic at once, of course he did. He reached past Naruto and tugged the choir. For a breath Hinata's count slipped, not because he took it. Because she gave it to open a different space. Temari overcompensated the crosswind and did not curse herself for it. Fu got giddy and then focused and put giddy away like a knife after whittling. Karen had kept a single tag on her body she wasn't going to use because it wasn't ready and Tsunade would kill her. She used it. It wasn't beautiful. It made a throat for the choir in the sky where there hadn't been one. She fed Naruto 5 heartbeats of clean lane and then sat down hard where no one saw her sit because she refused to be a problem in public. Now, Hinata said, exactly the place where Naruto would have bled himself for spectacle if no one had told him otherwise. He stepped. Rebirth reached for him a 6th time and he did not take it. He chose to stay. He burned anyway, but in the places he meant. He put his hands on Tenroku, not on armor or habit, on forearms, where the edges of weather gather, and directed the fall a final degree. They hit. It wasn't legendary. It was effective. The apex's center, the black disc inside the bigger bruise, cracked like lake ice in spring. Not all the way, enough to admit light in a thin, unwavering bar drawn across the Wida. The bell tower and the refugees and the boy who had let himself be reborn 5 times and decided that 5 was enough for today. Tenroku fell out of Black Sun Rock in a way he likely hadn't since he learned to be what he was. Not pathetic, human. He turned the fall into a roll that kept dignity and lost momentum. He came up on one knee and didn't lunge because the world was busy listening to the crack. Naruto walked toward him because running would have been rude and collapsing would have been dramatic. His chest hurt like it had learned a new alphabet. His aurora wing flickered, then settled. Into a low hum across the field that washed over ankles and wrists and patched torn coil edges without making anyone owe him. He set his hand on Tenroku's shoulder, palm flat, as if remembering not to scare a skittish animal. Stop, he said, soft enough that only a man trained to hear weather would catch it. Tenroku's smile when it came was exhausted and not unkind. If I do, he said, no one holds the sky. Then we hold it together so it gets bored and leaves, Naruto said. Democracy for clouds, Tenroku murmured, amused even now. Tedious, Naruto agreed. Safer. Tenroku lifted his hand. His aegis guttered. He could have slashed. He didn't. Above them the apex tried to knit. The crack held. Seime's bells tolling in a pattern Naruto would be embarrassed to admit he now knew by heart. Temari's wind combing it. Fu's laugh pulse at the edges. Karen's scratchy little seal throats threaded through. The sky had a choir and it was not tidy. I will rebuild it, Tenroku said, not a threat so much as an actuarial table. I will build it until someone makes a better rule. Naruto nodded. His knees decided to remind him they existed. He didn't take the invitation to sit. Good, he said, because if you stop trying, I have to start worrying you died. Tenroku huffed once, startled into humor. Then he looked at Naruto's hands, burned at the edges where Aurora Wing had met Aegis, and at the bell tower where Seimei stood with his staff planted like a stake that kept a tent from humiliating itself. He looked at the refugees, at the fields, at the little boy holding his grandmother's sleeve too tight and pretending not to. At the soldiers who had just remembered they were people. He let go, not theatrically. He relaxed one grip. The apex rose a foot, then 3. The crack widened, not because he split it but because he stopped insisting that it close. Aerolith slid at the rim of cloud, a wary animal considering whether to remain part of the trick. Tenroku lifted 2 fingers and the rock obeyed him by habit and then hesitated. He lowered his hand. The rock hovered. Quiet. Possible. Prisoner treaty. He asked Naruto. Conversational again, like men haggling over apples. Neither. Naruto said. You sit in a room with Tsunade and 3 grandmother committees and a priestess and Temari and Karen and Hinata and Kat and me and you answer questions for longer than you knew questions had hours. And you help fix what you broke. And when you try to take over the sky in a way that hurts my people, we stop you again. Tenroku's eyes, storm color trying out blue, did not roll, though they wanted to. You will be unbearable to govern. We're not being governed, Naruto said, cheerful. We're being neighbors. It shouldn't have worked. A lot of things shouldn't. Behind them, the last ministry squad on the ridge set their web to pre-trigger and reached for the lever that would cut the bell tower's legs. Seimei turned before any shinobi above or below could. He rang the Iroh N bell with both hands in an intent that was not for killing and not for mercy. The lever man stopped. It was small. It was everything. The squad laid their poles down. 2 ran. 1 took off his mask as if he had remembered his face. The last sat down and cried like someone who hadn't had permission to in the time since he learned what a bell could erase. Fu landed next to him and handed him half an apple without saying anything that would make it worse. Tsunade arrived like the end of a shift. Shoulders down, eyes up, body already choosing where the next bruise would go. She took in the disc. Pulling back from the borderlands edge, the aerolith not menacing, the bell tower standing, Naruto standing. Her mouth did not smile because she would not teach the village to spend relief like money. But the line between her eyebrows remembered where it used to live and softened. Paperwork, she said to Tenroku with lethal politeness. Unbearable, he agreed. Naruto walked to Seimei because leaving gratitude unspent curdles. The bell master didn't bow. He nodded like men who don't have time for pretense, then looked at Naruto's burned hands and clicked his tongue. You will keep doing this, he said, which wasn't disapproval. It was the weary affection of a craftsman for an apprentice who refuses to stop choosing beautiful problems. Naruto looked up at the bell. You saved them, he said. I stopped pretending I was saving the world by hurting children, Seimei said calmly. I will go back to teaching soup to stay in bowls during storms. Naruto grinned. I like your religion. It is called civic infrastructure. Seimei said, and if anyone else heard the humor hiding, they pretended not to for his dignity. The field exhaled the way land does when a season changes. The resonance core fanned through the mess, scolding and praising and tapping coils back into place. Karen took charge without ceremony, sent 3 teams to the bell towers, 2 to the pylons, 1 to the refugees. And 1 to fetch water for Fu because she refused to do it herself and then got bossy when anyone else tried to. Tamari sat on a fence post and spun a wind that kept smoke from a small cooking fire from making a baby cough. Hinata checked wrists and eyes and breath, human to human, her touch only as long as it needed to be. Cat found a dead buoy hub, kicked it, and told it, very softly, that it never belonged here. Naruto let Aurora Wing retract until it was just a temperature in his palm. He looked at Tenroku, now flanked by 2 Anbu who were not idiots and did not put hands on him. You coming? He asked. More invitation than custody. Tenroku glanced at the aerolith one last time. He lifted his chin a fraction in a silent order that the rock, for the first time, did not obey. It hung slanted, like a house deciding whether to remain stubborn. Stay, he told it anyway, because habit takes time to learn the new manners. He followed Naruto down the lane like a man walking into a long meeting with decent tea and unreasonable women. They went home in a parade that was not allowed to be a parade. People lined the road like they meant to be polite and then forgot to pretend. There we apples and bread and a baby who reached for Fu's hair and did not cry when Fu made a face because babies respect honest comedy. A grandmother took Seimei by the ear, in public, and Seimei did not eat her because the world is better when some people are allowed to be right about you and you may not appeal. At the tower, Tsunade put Tenroku in a room with windows that opened and guards who were trained to weigh respect against ropes. Treaty, she said, when the door shut, then looked at Naruto sideways. Talk. Naruto talked. Not long. He said what needed saying without story or lace. Apex, net, lanes, choir. Rebirth without going hungry. Aurora Wing without turning it into a miracle when it was a craft. He told her who had done what, loud with others and quiet around himself until Hinata interrupted by doing nothing but breathing, and he admitted the piece where he had died small 5 times and stayed anyway. Tsunade's eyes warmed like a certain kind of clean fire that makes metal honest. Paperwork, she reminded him again, because love is sometimes making you fill out forms that become laws later. When it was done and the town had eaten and the bells had rung old hour marks as if they had never done anything violent, Naruto and Hinata climbed to the roof with no particular destination. The night came back properly and brought stars. The band on his wrist cooled, then warmed. Then idled like a patient animal in a sunbeam. Your hands, Hinata said, meaning Aurora Wing's edges where he'd cooked himself. They'll be pretty scars, he said, a joke because what else? They'll be proof, she said, and didn't let him turn that into a line. He looked at her, then at the sky where he could still see the thin line the apex had left when it learned it wasn't alone. We didn't win, he said. No, she said, we made a rule. He sat. She sat. Their shoulders almost touched. He could feel the warmth of her without taking any of it. Down the slope of rooftops, Fu practiced flying slowly, the trick she hated most. Karen shouted unprintable encouragements and then pretended she hadn't when a kid on the next roof imitated her exact swear with glee. Tamari flipped the fan CLOSED and leaned back on her elbows and watched wind move laundry like flags on a day with nothing to sell. In the east, a bell rang the supper hour for a village that had refused to let a storm decide its morals. In the west, in a monastery that used to be a factory for obedience, Seimei wrote a new sequence for morning lessons: breathe, count, listen, choose. Naruto flexed his fingers. The feathered vectors didn't glow. They angled under the skin like promises. The aurora wing slept, a warmth he could pick up without drama. The sun thread hummed, careful as any needle kept sharp. He rested his palm flat on the rooftop, felt the heat the day had stored and decided not to spend, and laughed once, soft. Hungry? Hinata asked. Starving, he said, honest. Ramen? Yes, he said, reverent. They didn't talk about Tenroku. They didn't talk about the rains. They would. Not tonight. The village had earned a bowl and a bench and a friend's breath close by. When they stood, Naruto glanced down at the band. The feather sigils along it looked different because they hadn't moved. He pressed a thumb to the metal and thought. Not a prayer, a habit. Thank you for not leaving when I got loud. The heat under his sternum warmed the thumb as if amused. On the road to Ichiraku, a woman with a bell tucked in her apron passed them and nodded to Naruto, then to Hinata, then to no one and everyone. Somewhere beyond the river a giant rock considered lifestyle changes. Somewhere past the snowline, birds that had never respected politics flew through a gap in a storm and didn't even know it had once been a wall. Naruto ate until Shizune made a face at him and Hinata stole his egg and Tamari pretended to be unimpressed and Karen built a list over broth and Fu fell asleep with her chin in he. Our Palm and Cat dozed standing because she could, and Tsunade, alone in her office, took the treaty draft, wrote something unprintable in the margin, then crossed it out and wrote, Resonance Accords, Draft. They walked home through a village that remembered how to be itself. In a week the apex would test them again. In a month it would rain and they would climb and sing and stitch and redirect and share and heal. In that order or any other that got people from morning to dinner with their names intact. Tonight was a pause, not peace. Pauses are better. They let you breathe. Naruto paused on the step to his door, looked up at the useless portion of sky that had been taught a useful lesson, and grinned because he was a boy with a bird under his ribs and friends at his shoulders and a future that didn't care if it was ready. He would die small again and again if it bought the choice to live together large. He went inside. The door shut. The village stayed. The bells slept with one ear open, just in case they were needed for soup. Chapter 5 End.